there. Tonight we're exploring why it sucked to be a coal miner in the Appalachians. A day of pre-dawn whistles, dented lunch pails, and seams so low you shuffle on your knees. Not the Hollywood version you know. The company store could claim your paycheck in scrip before the dust even settled. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe. But only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature, or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. You wake up already owing money. The day hasn't even started. But the company ledger says your rent is due, the doctor fee is docked, the powder and fuse deduction is lined up like little bullets on a paycheck stub. The math is fast and ugly. Last pay you cleared maybe $38. The store took $42. Congratulations, you are going to work today for the privilege of being a little less broke tomorrow. The whistle decides the morning. In coal towns across West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and southwest Virginia, a steam whistle is the rooster you never asked for. 3 blasts before sunrise. You pull on trousers gritty with last night's dust, and the day's still stare of darkness. No romantic fog rolling over ridgelines here. Just smoke from the tipple and the sour bite of coal smoke in your throat. Breakfast is quick, heavy and engineered for survival. A biscuit, a slab of salt pork, maybe a fried egg if hens cooperated. A lunch pail waits, tin and dented, packed with cold beans, bread, and a wedge of pie that tastes like determination seasoned with debt. Out the door, the ground crunches. Company houses stack up the hollow like a symptom. Shotgun shacks with tar paper roofs, porches tilting toward the creek, outhouses set at an apologetic distance, company built, company owned, and priced like a monopoly, because it is one. Between 1900 and 1920, company towns multiplied through the southern Appalachians in lockstep with railroads and coke ovens. Whole communities engineered around coal. In many camps, the store is the only store, and the money is not really money. It's brass, literally. Scrip tokens stamped with names like Island Creek, Consolidation, or Pocahontas, minted by outfits such as the Ingle System of Ohio, and accepted about as widely as a bad promise. West Virginia law hammered at the truck system in the early 1900s, demanding cash pay, but clever bookkeeping and advances kept scrip alive into the 1930s. Historians and the U.S. Bureau of Labor Records agree on the effect. A closed loop. Work for the company. Live in the company's house. Buy at the company's store, often at a 20 to 30% markup over town prices. The coal camp is an ecosystem designed to keep you fed. Enough to keep you fed, enough to keep coming back. Down the path. The track follows the creek into a black mouth, carved into the hillside. The portal is a gash in rock, cross ties and timber forming a set of teeth. There's a line of men and boys and a few mules. The mules, blinking slow, ears flicking at the steam hiss and the stink of oil. Yes, mules. In the early 1900s, the Appalachians are full of them underground. The animals pull mine cars along low-gauge rails, their stubbornness legendary, and their resale value higher than yours. It's said more than once that mules sometimes get better accommodations. That line feels like exaggeration until you notice how carefully the company tracks their feed, their stables, and their injuries. Grab your lamp. The carbide lamp is the little volcano on your cap, a metal bowl where water drips onto calcium carbide and births acetylene gas. You open the valve, a match flares, and now your forehead spouts a blue-white flame. It's bright enough to feel reckless. In gassy mines, gassy meaning methane. This is your daily flirtation with combustion. Electric safety lamps exist, and the Davy lamp's wire gauze from the 19th century lets flame live without igniting external gas. But in many Appalachian bituminous mines in 1910, the carbide lamp rules. Bureau of Mines started in 1910 to reduce the fatal fireworks, establishing training, testing lamps, investigating disasters. They write sober sentences about methane and coal dust, and every page has a subtext. This kills people. Step into the slope, and the sound changes. Outside, the morning is all sight noises, bird calls, creak chuckle, the click of buckles on lunch pails. Inside, the mountain eats sound and gives back a different diet. Timber creaks, water drips, the iron on iron, chatter of wheels on rail. The air goes cool, then cold, and then steadily more stale. Ventilation might be a fan on the surface, pushing air down entries. Brattice cloth hung to channel it along, doors placed like lungs on hinges. A trapper boy used to sit by those doors, opening and closing them for mule trips, sometimes for 12 hours a day, silent in the dark. West Virginia banned boys under 14 in mines in 1913, but banned is an optimistic word in out-of-the-way hollows. The 1910 census counted thousands of mine boys across coal states. The work is smaller now, by statute. The habit isn't. This is a room and pillar mine. Think big grid. You carve rooms into the coal seam and leave pillars to hold the roof. Later, if the company is feeling ambitious and you are feeling unlucky, you go back and rob the pillars, taking the support and betting the roof stays up long enough. The coal seam height sets the rules of your body for the day. Some seams in West Virginia lay a respectable 5 or 6 feet. Others, the kind anthologized in Eastern Kentucky law, give you 28 to 36 inches. A 2.5-foot world teaches you to become a sideways letter of the alphabet. Your back learns grammar. Breathe through your mouth. That taste is not just coal. It's a cocktail. Coal dust, rock dust, oil sweat, sometimes methane with no smell, and carbon monoxide with no mercy. Miners give them folk names. Fire damp for methane, black damp for oxygen, poor air, strangled by carbon dioxide. White damp for monoxide, the silent killer. After damp for the soup that lingers after an explosion. Canary birds appear as tiny safety officers, brought in cages underground, because they keel over at bad air before you do. It's practical and a little grim. The practice comes from Britain and spreads here. The Bureau of Mines later favors chemical detectors and electric instruments. But in this era, a yellow bird with a nervous heart is as standard as your lunch pail. You go to your room, which sounds cozy and is not. It's a wedge of darkness at the edge of the working face. A cutter might have undercut the seam already with a machine, an electric or compressed air bar cutter chewing a slot along the bottom. In smaller or tighter places, the cutter is you with a pick, hacking a tiny trench so the coal will drop when loosened. You drill shot holes into the face with a hand auger or ratchet drill, swearing under your breath, because the bit binds and the coal spits grit. Into the holes go cartridges of powder, fuse, and cap. Early on it's black powder. Later, dynamite-like permissible explosives, designed to burn slower and not blow coal dust to the moon. A shot fire certified by the state is supposed to set them off at specified times, often near the end of shift when the mine can clear and the gases can blow out. In reality, a lot of places still let you fire your own shots, because rules have to swim through miles of mountain and 1,000 stubborn habits to get here. Set timbers. That's the rhythm nobody loves, because it cuts into tonnage. You're paid by the ton, with typical Appalachian rates around 50 to 80 cents per ton. In the 1910s, shifting with seam thickness, union presence, and mood of the way boss. Cutting and propping need time. And they don't pay. That wasn't a slip. The company often pays only for the coal car weight reaches the tipple. The rules as told by you. Digging is on your time. Timbering is on your time. Hauling your tools is on your time. Cleaning the gob of rock and slate you pried loose is on your time. Pay starts when coal is in a car, and pay stops when the car leaves. The United Mine Workers push for day pay for non-loading tasks. Non-union mines give that suggestion the kind of stare you give a rattlesnake. The Bureau of Labor Statistics notes around 1910 that average daily earnings in bituminous mines hover around $2 to $3, but that hides how wildly it swings with seam and season. Coal is feast and famine. Snow or floods can stop trains. Markets crash, and your daily rate goes from barely enough to not enough fast. The roof talks. It pops. It rumbles. It shoves pebbles into your collar. Roof and rib falls are the statistically consistent killers. Through the early 19s, about a third of mine fatalities come from material falling from above or from the side. Another big killer is haulage. Getting run over by trips of coal cars or crushed between a mule and a rib. Explosions make headlines because they kill by the hundred, but the mountain prefers one at a time in regular rhythm. The numbers are a drumbeat. In 1907, the deadliest year in US coal mining, more than 3,200 men and boys die in mines nationwide. On December 6th of that year, at Monongah, West Virginia, explosions in 2 mines kill at least 362. That official number is tidy and likely low. Some estimates run over 500, because many unregistered immigrant workers never made it to the books. The Bureau of Mines is born in the shadow of Monongah, because the scale of it moves even Washington. Before lunch, your face is black, your ears are black, and your teeth wear a narrow white smile that will look like a bad joke later. The coil of fuse in your pocket is gritty. Your gloves are black tar ghosts of themselves. You load a car, maybe a ton and a half by hand. Shovel, lift, toss, shovel, lift, toss. There are no ergonomics here. There is a back brace called youth, and it works until it doesn't. A mule driver arrives to hook the car and take it away. He is 12 if the law is fiction today, and 15 if it's not. Mules regard him with the same spiritual weariness you feel for management. Your lunch break is a careful truce. A chunk of bread, beans, cold coffee, if you're lucky. Lean back with your cap lamp off, and the dark wraps around like a second skin. People describe it as absolute. This is not the dark of night outdoors. This is the dark that exists before the world is made. It is crowded with knowledge. The names of the dead ride it. You've seen the boards at the mouth of the mine listing accidents and days without incident. You know the date. Eccles in Raleigh County, 1914, 183 killed. Parole, Keokee, Red Ash. The list goes on. In Kentucky, Clay County has a run of disasters that become vocabulary. The 1912. 191. 3 strikes along Paint Creek and Cabin Creek in West Virginia. Add a different set of stories. About gun thugs, Baldwin Felts detectives, riding armored trains like the Bull Moose Special and Machine. Guns that speak economic policy. The West Virginia judiciary signs off on yellow dog contracts backed eventually by the 1917 Hitchman Coal and Coke Co. Mitchell Supreme Court decision, making it easier for companies to demand you promise not to join a union and to get injunctions against strikes. Businesslike handwriting on court stationery rearranges what the First Amendment means underground. Back to work. The shot firer arrives and nods. He carries a box like it contains bones. If the mine runs by the book, he will fire the shots as the day ends, clearing the area. Then the ventilation will run overnight to carry out fumes and methane. If the mine runs like a lot of ruled drift mines, the book looks like scrap paper. Shots boom like thunder trapped in a closet. The smell of powder and burning coal curls around your tongue. Coal dust lifts like a promise waiting to explode. Later, in the 1920s, the Bureau of Mines will push rock dusting, spraying or throwing pulverized limestone over surfaces to keep coal dust from propagating an explosion. That practice saves lives when adopted. Before it becomes standard, dust explosions turn small mistakes into headlines. On paper, engineers worry about the minimum explosive concentration of coal dust in air, about 50 grams per cubic meter under ideal conditions. But in the real mine face, it is simpler. Hot flame plus suspended fine dust equals flash fire down an entryway at 2,000 feet per second. In the language of after-action reports, flame fronts race. In the language you use, fire chases air and eats everything in between. There is always someone new to bury. The Bureau of Mines dispatches teams for rescue and research. They produce bulletins filled with diagrams that look like battle plans and read like prayers. They teach the use of self-rescuers, little chemical oxygen generators that can give you minutes of breathable air. That tech is decades in the future for your day. For now, your worst tool is your lungs. Dust goes where water doesn't. The air in your section might run 5 or 6 milligrams of respirable dust per cubic meter without effective suppression. Nobody measures it today. Decades later, NOsh will pass the lungs of miners in central Appalachia and find a resurgence of coal workers' pneumoconiosis, black lung, especially among those in thin seams where cutting rock is standard. In the 2010, studies will show over 10% of miners with 25 plus years underground in central Appalachia showing radiographic black lung with a spike in progressive massive fibrosis. The worst kind. Congress will set legal dust limits in 1969 at 2.0 milligrams per cubic meter and later reduce them to 1.5. None of this helps you at noon today. Coal and silica swirl together, 1,000 tiny knives in motion. The cough is not immediate. It is a 30-year later problem you start paying on with every breath now. Customs, practices, and little economies carry you through the afternoon. You save the largest lumps to the top of the car because sometimes the way boss is more generous when the car looks juicy. Another piece of folk wisdom says, pile it neat to keep from being docked for slate. Docking is legalized theft, dressed in procedure, a deduction for impurities that can erase a day's worth because you were not telepathic about shale layers. In theory, state law gives miners the right to elect a check weighman to verify weights. In practice, in non-union camps, your check weighman is a rumor. In union strongholds, they are real men with pencils and a willingness to be unpopular. The United Mine Workers of America is integrated from early on in many districts, a rare fact in a Jim Crow world. And check weighman can be black, immigrant, or native-born, standing shoulder to shoulder. That solidarity is not a fairy tale. Coal companies hire out-of-state detectives with rifles to keep it from working too well. Lift, toss, repeat. A mule brays like a broken hinge. Someone swears in Polish, or Italian, or in a soft drawl from Alabama. The Appalachian coalfields during the boom are a babble of accent and origin. West Virginia alone draws tens of thousands of immigrants between 1900 and 1920, alongside African American families recruited from the Deep South by labor agents waving train tickets and the promise of work. In many camps, those men work the same seam, fight the same dust, and trade recipes and songs. Baseball teams form, with black and white players on the same roster, in some coal camps, years before the big leagues consider it. The company likes a good baseball game. It keeps the evening busy and the talk away from union halls. Toward the end of the shift, a train of empty cars rattles past, and a hinge on the mountain moves again. Your last car hits the count. Your shovel arm is a rubber band that started the day as steel. You pull timbers tight, check the roof once more, and begin the long walk or low rumble ride back to daylight. The air freshens by inches. A mule coughs. Your lamp throws its small universe ahead. Outside, the sun is wrong. It sits where your body says it should be morning and declares it late afternoon. Time under a mountain does strange things to a human clock. At the lamp house, the man with the ledger scratches entries with a practiced indifference. You hand over your copper lamp, your hat with the scorch mark, the reek of acetylene. Your face looks like a map of the mine in black. The wash house, if your camp has one, is a string of cold taps and a trough. Many don't. You go home with yourself still wearing the mine. In some bigger outfits, especially those owned by U.S. Steel's coal affiliates, like the United States Coal and Coke Company, there are bathhouses by the 1910s and 1920s, because they want their labor to look a little more like a system. In smaller camps, your bath is a galvanized tub on the back porch with water heated over a stove. You pour that over your head, and an entire day runs down the steps in a black stream. And unto all this, there's the weigh office and pay window. You do not step up today. Pay is every 2 weeks or monthly, but you lean in enough to see the arithmetic waiting. A quarter-ton docked for slate, $3 for doctor, 20 cents for powder, house rent, lamp oil, if you were in an era right before carbide took over. Over at the store, Mrs. A.M. So receives her script slip and counts it like a blessing. Cash pay appears some places after persistent agitation and state legislation. Even then, advances are in brass. The store shines with promises. Flour in barrels, cloth, sticks of candy included like bait. The markups are not secret. Testimonies to congressional committees. Later in the teens complain of a sack of flour at $1.50 in town, going for $2.00 in camp. Some company stores are fair. Many more are not. The phrase in miner slang, "pluck me," says exactly how people view them. Now you head there because your daughter needs shoes, and your wife needs coffee, and you need the good kind of tobacco that costs more than your better judgment. The clerk weighs bacon and pats the ledger with a familiar smile. He is not a villain. He is one part of a machine that runs on debits. You sign with a flourish that hides a small wound. The ledger will follow you until you quit or get fired. And if you get fired, eviction usually means a man with a badge that does not belong to the state, carrying a gun that does. Company guards. Their names become regional myth. Baldwin Felts, detective agency. Men hired by coal operators to keep order and to define order as whatever the company likes. They search trains for union organizers. They evict families during strikes and toss their beds into mud, and then stand and tell a court they did so politely. In May 1920, in the town of Matewan, a pro-union police chief named Sid Hatfield refuses to let Baldwin Felts agents evict families without proper papers. A shootout in the rain follows. 10 men die, including 7 agents. This is still in your future, if today's a random day, in the 1910s. which is how time works when you live in an endless present tense. Hatfield will be gunned down on courthouse steps the next year. The Union will grow anyway, because fear and grief travel on their own rails. Dinner is baked beans with molasses and a crust that makes it feel like more. There is sound in the camp, fiddle music from a porch, the thunk of a baseball into a glove, a church bell with cracked dignity. A preacher walks a path paved by soft dirt and hard news. He talks about the hazards of alcohol and the miracle of salvation. He leaves out scrip because hell is in the details, and he has to live here too. A meeting could be happening down by the schoolhouse. Someone speaking in a low voice about dues and strikes, and what happened in Pennsylvania in 1902, when the anthracite miners struck and won the attention of the president. The United Mine Workers talk is practical. Check Wayman, shorter hours, pay for dead work like timbering, a say in who gets hired, the end of yellow dog contracts, but quiet. Mine guards listen like wolves that read. On the other hand, there is the company's softer power. 4th of July picnics with all the hot dogs you can eat, as long as you cheer for the right baseball team. A company doctor you pay for with payroll deduction because disease does not care how brave you are. West Virginia's legislature created miners' hospitals in the early 1900s. Outposts in Beckley, Fairmont, Welch, recognizing that coal fields are far from specialized care and close to catastrophe. That is state-level paternalism meeting corporate paternalism. A strange marriage in a place defined by inflammable rock. After supper, the ledger sits on the mantel like family. Numbers talk louder than any organizer. A month with a good seam and steady rail service, you come out a few dollars ahead. A bad month, you go under again. Wages in 1915 might buy a coat. By 1920, inflation eats coal paychecks like termites. The coal industry boom during World War I turns into a bust by 1922, then a grueling decline through the 1920s as oil and hydroelectric cut into markets and mines mechanize. The United Mine Workers lose ground in the late 20s. The Great Depression hits, and the ground goes out from under, whole hollows. But that is not tonight. Tonight, the lamps along the row of houses are small constellations. Your lungs feel like you swallowed a handful of sandpaper. Your hands smell of sulfur and grease. Someone down the way is telling a story about a man who lived 3 days under a cave-in, breathing through a pipe. That is not a legend. It's the sort of miracle that makes it into newspapers with headlines big enough to make people in cities look up from their coffee for a second. The U.S. Bureau of Mines sends rescue teams with Draeger oxygen apparatus, and photographs show men in bug-eyed masks stepping into smoke like mythic creatures that learned science. For every rescue celebrated, a dozen burials happen in quiet, with women wearing black that they cannot afford. Take a moment for the numbers again, because numbers are the bluntest way to say this. Between 1890 and 1910, more than 30,000 miners die in U.S. coal mines. West Virginia's annual fatality rate per 1,000 miners peaks above 3 in the early 1900s, meaning 3 men dead for every 1,000 who work in a year, with many more injured. Farmington in 1968 will kill 78 and lead to the 1969 Coal Mine Health and Safety Act, which finally gives federal teeth to enforcement and sets dust standards. Upper Big Branch in 2010 will kill 29 in an explosion that investigative reports call preventable. The line from now to then is as straight as a mine rail. Every improvement is written in somebody's blood. The irony is irregular in your life. The company posts a sign about safety while paying extra for coal, brought out fast. The law demands separate weights while the scale house answers to the operator. You carry a lunch pail, while the company hosts a ration table during a strike. Because charity looks better in the papers than collective bargaining. You settle for a spot on a baseball team because it feels like a win. Your team might play against a rival camp with a steel mill on their caps. John L. Lewis will come later, a square-jawed man who can pull a country into a strike. He will organize the Congress of Industrial Organizations after breaking with the American Federation of Labor. He will make the UMWA formidable in the 1930s, using the New Deal's National Industrial Recovery Act in 1933 and later the National Labor Relations Act in 1935 to pry open contracts. He will blockade coal, push for higher wages, and win a welfare and retirement fund by the 40s. But that is a different decade's day. For you, a bath on the back porch, a towel that starts white and ends in a smear of geology. A child leans in, fingertip making a clean streak on your arm to prove you were under there. The look they give you is half awe, half fear, because miners are both seats at a supper table and names on a hillside. The words black lung aren't in the air yet. In 1943, 2 Welsh doctors will write a paper that finally forces broad medical recognition of coal workers' pneumoconiosis. In the United States, miners will have to fight until the late 1960s for recognition, culminating in the 1969 Act that includes black lung benefits. For now, coughs are called smoker's cough, and pain is called a complaint, and then called nothing at all. Evening brings community that's both real and curated. The company church might be non-denominational, with a preacher paid partly in mercy and partly by the operator. Or it could be one of several, since coal camps can be crowded with denominations, each with its own potluck and opinion. Gospel spills into blues and ballads on porches after services. Ballads about disasters in places you have heard of. Spring Hill in Canada, Dawson in New Mexico, Benwood in West Virginia. The songs are beautiful and specific because specificity makes grief real. A man could start singing about Monongah, and you know the verse before the words land. It is history set to a melody that never promises a good outcome, just an attentive audience. If it is 1912, there might be a tent colony across the river where evicted strikers live. If it is 1921, a rumor from down the road says thousands of miners marched with red bandanas tied around their necks toward Logan County, a Union army wearing its color. At Blair Mountain, gunfire stitched over ridges and bombs fell from hired planes. The U.S. Army arrived to end it. In court, organizers wore suits, and juries wrote a kind of measured condemnation, and then sent men home anyway. The coalfields remember details the news forgets, such as how many Union cards got signed after a battle, how many windows got shot out in retaliation, how many coffins the undertaker ordered on credit. But you, today, fold your shirt over a chair and feel grit fall onto the floorboards, like rain you track inside. Your knuckles are scraped where the roof decided to introduce itself. Your shins bloom with bruises shaped like track ties. The little cut on your cheek from a flying chip of coal stings when your wife wipes it with a rag, dipped in water, boiled in a kettle that was bought with scrip, that bought the sugar that sweetened the coffee you will drink. While you sit still and let your heart slow down, there is paperwork you did not fill out, and paperwork the company filled out for you. The hiring sheet lists your job as miner, loader, driver, machine runner, laborer. Men listed as one job often perform 4. The mine inspector's report might never mention your section because it passed without obvious hazard today. Meanwhile, the inspector himself likely climbed down entry one day last month and targed at improper gratis, wrote a fine that will be paid in the future or never. State inspectors, in this era, have limited staff and unlimited road miles. The number of mines and the miles of entries in West Virginia alone would make one office a satire if it were not tragic. The Federal Bureau of Mines can advise and investigate but cannot enforce until the mid-20th century. Enforcement will come later, and it will come because the alternative is a constantly updated list of dead. There is a little joy today. There has to be, or people quit the script. Kids play tag between houses, smearing each other with soot, laughing loud as if it is not a funeral colour. A neighbour shows up with a fiddle and a tune that came from Scotland by way of a grandmother's memory. A bottle makes the rounds. Someone tells a Mother Jones line. Not the one about prayer and hell, though that's famous. Pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living. They quote the rest of her. The part's about the right to organize, and the way a community can decide it will not live like this forever. Mary Harris Jones came to these hills often, a short, older woman with a powerful will, walking into tent camps, wearing black and lacing her admonitions with fire. She wasn't Appalachian, but she understood coal. The operators did not appreciate her sermons. The miners did. A letter might arrive, if the stars and the train schedule align. It says that a cousin got killed by a roof fall in Harlan County or found better wages in a Detroit auto plant. The Great Migration moves through this town too. African-American miners who came up from Alabama or Georgia sometimes take a leap to cities where a different kind of wage slavery is offered with less overt gunfire. Immigrant miners who mastered English by cussing at mules send for brothers and nephews or leave for Pittsburgh's mills when coal cuts back. The camp is not static. It breathes people in and out like an old man with wheezing lungs. Night at last. The steam whistle signs off. The mountain looms like a promise and a threat. You lie down and your body keeps working. Your arms shovel phantom dirt. Your ears monitor the sound of the roof, as if above you there is still a strata of shale waiting to decide if it stays put. Your chest hitches, and now and then a cough comes up with the bitterness of a debt collector. You can name the parts of the mine by taste when you try. Before sleep, there is one more list. In your head, tomorrow's plan. Bring extra wedges. Talk to the weigh boss about yesterday's docking, though he will look at you with a patience that is really contempt. Check that new crack above the right corner of your room. Nag the mule driver to keep trips shorter so you are not caught between car and rib. Scrounge a new file for your pick. Borrow for powder if the powder boy won't extend credit until pay. In the dark, the disasters parade by in memory, like a warning painted on a wall. Monongah, December 6, 1907. Eccles, April 28, 1914. Benwood, April 28, 1924. An unlucky date shared by two different years. Farmington, November 20th, 1968, though in your timeline that's a rumor of a future. Upper Big Branch, April 5th, 2010. Later still, a technical report that reads like a thunderclap. On the other end of time there is the day the union came through with a contract that paid for dead work and shortened hours, or the day in 1933 when Section 7 of the NERA gave you the first legal whisper of a right to join a union without being fired for it. Those dates are anchors in a river that tries to carry everybody downstream fast. It is fashionable in certain parts of the country later to imagine Appalachia as a place of noble poverty or backward stubbornness. That neat story falls apart in a coal camp because nothing here is tidy. The production per miner goes up in the 1920s as machines arrive. Coal cutters, loaders, conveyor belts, while employment goes down. Productivity looks great on a chart. It looks like a layoff in your home. The operators prefer to spend money on machinery and guards rather than on men's lungs and wages, and the numbers endorsed that preference for decades. Meanwhile, the miners turn their lungs into an industry statistic nobody budgets for because it is paid in human installments over decades. There's a reason coal country produced militants and musicians at the same time. The day does not end when you climb into bed. It ends when a community argues with itself and decides to push back together. The Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921 involves as many as 10,000 miners. The deployment of the U.S. Army to end it is not subtle. What follows is a difficult decade in which the Union retreats. By the late 1930s, a wave of organizing returns with New Deal protections and John L. Lewis at the helm, and the UMWA signs contracts that become a standard for industrial America. An 8-hour day, safety committees, checkweighman, grievance procedures. The long echo of those fights reaches into the 1969 Coal Act after Farmington, when Congress finally mandates regular inspections and real penalties and reduces allowable dust. And yet, even later, the disease recurs because mining changes. Thin seams in central Appalachia mean cutting more rock, raising silica dust, and a new scourge arrives under an old name. NIOSH maps clusters of progressive, massive fibrosis in southern West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and southwest Virginia in the 2010s, the worst clusters on record. Regulations get adjusted. Companies adapt and sometimes resist. The loop is durable. Promises are written. Enforcement is written too slowly. Your day is one page in that ledger. It starts owing and ends tired. And it is filled with skilled labor that the broader world romanticizes without ever inhaling it. The work requires geological knowledge, mechanical savvy, strategic patience, teamwork. It requires knowing when the roof is lying to you and when the mule is telling the truth. It requires running calculations as constant as the clack of a track joint, the weight of the car, the distance to the face, the time until the shot fire arrives, the price at the store this week, the chances of a strike, the weather that will decide if trains can run, and whether there is any point in bringing out 10 cars if the tipple is backed up for lack of rail cars. Many histories erase the immediate physical calculus in favor of macroeconomics. Share of GDP, tonnage per year. The Appalachian region produces hundreds of millions of tons of coal in the early 20th century, fueling railroads, steel mills, and the electrification of cities. But at the scale of a day in your boot, coal is a box on your back and a ledger in your pocket and a cough at night. A macro rides on the micro like a train on rails, hammered into ties, 3 inches from a man's face. You turn on your side. The bed groans. There is silence outside, except for the creak and a late train braking for the tipple. The whistle blows out. What sounds like a sigh. You slip into sleep, thinking about the next morning's whistle. You are not the hero of an adventure story. You are the worker who makes stories possible, documented in Bureau of Mines reports, union minutes, payroll deductions, the minutes of county courts, the letters of Mary Harris Jones, the pages of James Green's The Devil Is Here in These Hills, the oral histories in the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, the injury statistics compiled by the Bureau of Labor, the NIOSH charts. At some point between waking and dreaming, you remember a simple arithmetic that miners repeat like a catechism. Work safe. Watch the roof. Count your shots. Stack the props. Keep the air moving. Argue with the way boss. Keep the union card close. Save for a rainy day. Watch the company men. Stay out of debt. The last one is a joke that brings the room down. In a coal camp in 1910 or 1920, stay out of debt is like saying stay out of the weather. The weather is the whole sky. Morning will come again. You will shoulder your lunch pail, light your lamp, and step into the mountain. This is the entire point of the story, told straight. It is not romantic. It is not tragic by design. It proves itself every day because the job is there to be done. It is also a structural trap built into the landscape by partnerships of capital and law. Those partnerships wage their own campaigns in newspapers and legislatures, hiring Baldwin Felts on one hand and a lyric poet on the other hand to tell the country that what happens here is necessary, honorable, and properly managed. The miners eventually tell their own story, back in a voice that can be heard over dynamite and denial. Evening again, your eyes close finally. Inside your lungs, a little more dust decides to stay forever. On your dresser, the script coins gleam a dull, convincing gold. Outside, under the crust of a midnight Appalachian sky, the mine air goes on moving because the fan never sleeps. The mine breathes. So do you. One because of the other. And the ledger waits, patient as gravity. Moving on, our next tale is titled How the Byzantine Empire Preserved Ancient Knowledge. A book of Archimedes went to a Paris auction in 1998. Disguised as a medieval prayer book, under the prayers hid pages that had been scraped, folded, and rearranged. Like a Renaissance thrift store project, multispectral imaging peeled back the disguise and revealed a 10th century Byzantine copy of Archimedes' Lost the Method, along with On Floating Bodies and Stomachion. Suddenly, a long caricature about Byzantium as incense, icons, and bureaucracy got interrupted by a flashing neon sign that read, "The Greeks of Constantinople carried mathematical fire through 1,000 years of chaos." This is the part of the story that disturbs lazy history. The Roman Empire did not die in the West and abandon its books to the moths. It moved east to a city that would be called Constantinople, kept the payroll running, taxed the wine, rebuilt the walls after earthquakes, and also maintained the kind of obsessive book culture that saves civilizations. Scholars like Reviel Netz and William Noel wrote entire volumes about that Archimedes palimpsest, and the villain turns hero plot twist lands with satisfying clarity. An anonymous scribe in 10th century Constantinople copied Archimedes onto parchment. A later monk in the 13th century scraped that parchment to make a prayer book. That act looked like vandalism to modern eyes. It functioned as preservation in slow motion. Without that copy, that scrape, that rebind, enormous chunks of ancient mathematics evaporate. The surprise is not that a great empire saved its books. The surprise is how the saving worked. Who did it, how long it lasted, and how many modern shelves trace their contents to patient hands around the Golden Horn. The numbers are not small. Tens of thousands of Greek manuscripts survive today. The largest clusters sit in places like the Vatican Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Oxford, and Venice's Marciana Library, and most travelled there from Byzantium. Mount Athos alone still shelters thousands of Greek codices. The Megi codices of Aeschylus and Sophocles are 10th and 11th century Byzantine copies. The finest Homer with the most precious ancient scholia, the Venetus A, is a 10th century Constantinopolitan manuscript that ended up in Venice through the network of Byzantine emigres and donors, including the powerhouse patron Cardinal Bessarion, who donated hundreds of Greek books to the city in 1468. The map in a modern atlas that still nods to Ptolemy's geometry of the earth can thank Byzantine scribes, and later a 13th century scholar named Maximus Planudes, who revived Ptolemy's geography in Greek, corrected place names, and kicked cartography back into motion. The scene opens much earlier. In 330, Constantine I refounded Byzantium as Constantinople. The city glowed with the usual imperial swagger, hip to both marble and tax codes. The capital always loved paperwork. That obsession kept something fragile alive, a centralized culture of literacy that never went dark. Theodosius II founded the Pandidactyrion in 425, essentially an imperial university, with chairs in Greek and Latin grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, and law. The old civic schools of the Roman world had not vanished. They had pivoted east. Anthony Caldelis and Averil Cameron have both hammered this point for years. Byzantium did not see itself as a medieval outlier. It saw itself as the Roman state, with Greek paideia as the foundation of high status. That social vanity had consequences. Parents wanted their kids to sound like Demosthenes at dinner and to quote Homer before dessert. Students learned grammar on Dionysius Thrax, rhetoric from Hermogenes, and philosophy through Aristotle's categories. That curriculum required copies, and copies required professional scribes, and scribes required abundant parchment, regulated supplies, and pay. The big technical break for preserving the ancient world came in the 9th century with the spread of the so-called Greek minuscule script. Before minuscule, scribes wrote in stately uncials, which looked noble and cost time. Minuscule condensed everything, sped up copying, and packed more lines on a page without wrecking legibility. A minuscule page can carry roughly a third more text than a comparable uncial layout, a dramatic savings when parchment is basically animal skin and every leaf cost the life of a sheep or goat. A sizable codex consumed the hides of a small flock. Byzantine minuscule showed up just as the Macedonian dynasty stabilized the empire after the 9th century iconoclast wars. This timing mattered. The empire entered a bookish growth spurt that scholars like Paul Lemerle labeled the first Byzantine humanism. The Staudios monastery in Constantinople operated a copy machine disguised as a scriptorium. The monks wrote rules about writing rules, copied classical texts alongside scripture, and developed tidy editorial practices. They added scholia, corrected accents, and carefully counted lines, the stitch koi, to ensure completeness. There are colophons where a scribe groans about cold fingers, or thanks God for finishing a long text. There are more colophons where a scribe simply notes the stichometric count. That dull bookkeeping saved countless pages from silent loss. The empire's bureaucrats treated old books as raw materials for culture and law. Justinian had closed the philosophical school in Athens in 529, a date people loved to weaponize as a symbol of anti-classical bigotry. The gloating is misplaced. The same emperor commissioned the Corpus Juris Civilis between 529 and 534, a comprehensive digest of Roman law that became the spine of continental legal tradition. Tribonian and his team compiled the Institute, the Digest, the Code, and later novels. They did not just preserve the law, they organized it in a way that allowed 11th century Italians of Bologna to resurrect legal science. A modern civil law course leans on a text curated under an emperor who also shut down a private school with deep pagan pedigree. Real history tolerates contradictions. Byzantium specialized in contradictions that somehow worked. The librarians and scholars of the 9th and 10th centuries went on a rescue mission across genres. Photius, Patriarch of Constantinople, compiled the Bibliotheca, also called the Myriel-Biblion, a personal set of book reports on roughly 280 works he had read, many now lost. In those summaries, he snuck entire pages of precious content, with quotes and critical notes from historians like Ctesias and Memnon, novelists like Heliodorus, and theologians with spicy opinions. When a book did not survive, Photius still captured the aroma. Likewise, Constantine the Y Porphyrogenitus in the 10th century commissioned the Excerpta Constantianiana, a state project that digested historical works into themed collections like Embushes, Virtues and Vices, Ambushes, and Domestic Affairs. Those excerpt volumes preserve slices of historians whose complete texts vanished, including Dexippus and Priscus. That is government-grade curation. It reads like a management book built from fragments of antiquity. Meanwhile, the Suda arrived in the 10th century like a print-era Wikipedia, with better Latin. The Suda is a massive lexicon, an encyclopedia that preserves biographical scraps, quotations, and definitions from hundreds of authors, many otherwise lost. It cites and paraphrases, confuses a little, enlightens a lot. Michael Sellows in the 11th century wrote with urgent charm about Plato and Aristotle and worked the ancient canon into a Christian intellectual life. Erastus of Caesarea, active around 900, commissioned minuscule codices of Plato and Lucian, wrote marginal notes, and helped transmit Marcus Aurelius's meditations. Those Erastus codices became anchor witnesses for critical editions centuries later. Eustathius of Thessaloniki in the 12th century produced sprawling commentaries on Homer that packaged earlier Scholia into a late Byzantine textbook multiverse. John Sedzes manic scribbled his way through ancient myths and tragedies with commentaries that saved quotations from dozens of authors invisible anywhere else. The empire kept science alive, if not always as an experimental practice, then as a language that could be revived. The works of Euclid's Elements came down mainly through Greek manuscripts copied in Byzantium, with Arabic side routes that occasionally preserved alternative lines. Ptolemy's Almagest remained the astronomer's Bible in Greek, while Islamic astronomers built upon it in Arabic. Galen's medical texts swam in both Greek and Arabic, and Byzantine physicians like Oribasius in the 4th century, Aetius of Amida in the 6th, and Paul of Aegina in the 7th, compiled monster handbooks that medical schools from Baghdad to Salerno mined for centuries. John Philoponus in the 6th century, working in Greek, attacked Aristotle's physics and suggested ideas about impetus that would later inform Arabic and Latin debates. Leo the mathematician in the 9th century ran the imperial school at the Magnora, corresponded across borders, and reportedly designed a spy-level beacon chain across Anatolia to signal Arab raids. He taught arithmetic that used new numerals, and his scene intersected with the Arabic translation movement in complicated ways that Dimitri Gutas outlined in Greek thought. Arabic culture. Knowledge traveled east, west, and back again. The Greek Empire turned into a transit hub that sometimes lost cargo, sometimes found a better route, and often kept a redundant copy just in case. Books did not always stay pristine. Parchment is skimpy, pricey, and reusable. Palimpsests became an economy. Scribes scraped older texts, wrote newer ones, and unknowingly hid old treasures in the process. The Archimedes palimpsest is the celebrity case, but there are many humbler examples. Sinai and Mount Athos hide palimpsest layers that modern imaging still pulls back like magic wallpaper. When a later scribe wrote a prayer book in 1229 in Jerusalem out of older leaves, that decision slapped a calendar date on the survival of Greek science. The archaism survived because someone needed a missile. Preservation in Byzantium worked because it was duct-taped into practical life. The newest manual for court ceremony, Constantine Veers de Ceremonies, uses vocabulary and sensibilities from classical rhetoric while describing mechanical birds that chirped with bellows and lions that roared in the throne room. The Byzantine court loved automata. Inspired by Hero of Alexandria's pneumatics, entertainment saved engineering, and engineering anchored a memory of Hellenistic science. The drama spikes in 1204. Crusaders led by men with unpaid bills and creative justification sacked Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. Libraries burned, monasteries were looted, statues were melted for cash, manuscripts walked out the door with Venetian captains who knew a prophet when they saw one. The horror is real, but the plot twist does not let villains hoard all the agency. That looting also moved Greek books into Italian and French collections, where some survived the next centuries of imperial collapse and trouble. Giovanni Orispo returned to Italy in 1423 with 238 Greek manuscripts stuffed into his luggage, including complete works of Plato, Plotinus, Proclus, and many historians. He had bought them in Constantinople as an emergency extraction. Manuel Chrysoloras began teaching Greek in Florence in 1397, training a generation that would include translators who could finally read the books coming west. Cardinal Bessarion, a Greek scholar turned Latin churchman, built a library of Greek manuscripts and donated them to Venice in 1468, providing a foundation for the Marciana Library. George Gemistos Plethon thundered about Plato at the Council of Florence in 1439 and rekindled Hellenic flame in Italian humanists who thought Rome alone should own the past. The Aldine Press in Venice, guided by Aldus Manutius, and staffed with Cretan and Florentine Greeks like Marcus Messurus, printed the first edition of Aristotle in Greek between 1495 and 1498, and the first printed Plato in 1513. Those printed texts leaned heavily on Byzantine manuscripts, some corrected by Byzantine scholars who knew the accent marks like muscle memory. The line runs straight. The intense Greek literacy of the Byzantine state meets Italian money in new presses, and the result is the Renaissance, with better kerning. But wait, the traffic did not only go west through Venetian ports. The Byzantine East sat across from the Islamic world, where the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, during the 9th and 10th centuries, sponsored translation of Greek science into Arabic. Syriac-speaking Christians and Greek scholars worked together to move Galen, Euclid, Ptolemy, and Arabic, with commentaries that advanced the sciences beyond the Greek baseline. Some of those translators trained or corresponded with scholars connected to Byzantium. The empire also imported back into Greek some materials known better in Arabic. Maximus Planudes, that 13th century polymath ambassador, introduced Hindu-Arabic numerals more widely to Byzantium and translated Latin works into Greek while revising Greek mathematics. He edited and pushed Diophantus's Arithmetica, whose Greek survives partially because of a 13th century Byzantine copy, while the Arabic tradition preserves other books that the Greek lacks. The traffic moved in arcs. A text might start in Hellenistic Alexandria, travel to Constantinople, jump to Baghdad via Syriac translators, evolve with Arabic commentaries, and then return west through Sicily or Spain with Latin translations. Byzantium was neither gatekeeper nor idle bystander. It was a leg in a relay, and for several key handoffs, it steadied the baton when others stumbled. The myth that Byzantium hated classical learning dies fast in the face of specific names and pages. Basil the Great in the 4th century wrote an address to young men on how to profit from Greek literature, prefacing a Christian strategy for reading Homer and Plato selectively. Michael Pallo's in the 11th century obsession posted about ancient philosophy with barely concealed glee. Anna Komnene in the 12th century wrote the Alexiad in classicizing Greek and ran a circle that commissioned new commentaries on Aristotle, including Michael of Ephesus's work on biological treatises. Eustathius of Thessalonica produced his enormous Homeric commentaries that distill Alexandrian scholarly traditions into digestible detail. The Komnenian revival pulled knowledge out of storage and plugged it into statecraft, medicine, and rhetoric. A Greek rhetorician in purple slippers taught schoolboys how to imitate Demosthenes' invective, while a surgeon in the suburbs used Paul of Aegina's book to fix a broken arm. Scribes and editors also made choices that define what survived. The tragic poets illustrate this with surgical precision. Most of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides survive through 10th century Byzantine manuscripts that bundle a canon of plays chosen for teaching. The so-called triad selection taught 3 plays from each tragedian, packaged for school use, while other manuscripts preserved a wider set, but with gaps. Euripides survives best, partially because later Byzantine readers liked his style and compiled more of his plays. Aeschylus and Sophocles survive through a limited but precious number of codices, like the Laurentianus 32.9 for Sophocles and the Medicius for Aeschylus. Pindar's odes come through a handful of manuscripts that passed through Byzantine hands. Thucydides and Herodotus lived mostly in 10th century copies. No cosmic librarians saved Greek literature uniformly. Byzantine teachers did. Their taste became a sieve. Their sieve became the canon. The methods were not casual. Byzantine scribes applied critical symbols in margins to mark variants and used catenary commentaries that braided together earlier scholia into an anchored chain. They maintained accentuation and breathings in Greek that helped later readers pronounce and pass the language. They wrote scholia that sometimes preserve lines of lost works inside the comment. They counted stitui because they felt the weight of loss. They created florilegia, anthologies of choice excerpts arranged by topic, which later allowed scholars to reconstruct quotations from lost works. Stobaeus in the 5th century compiled a gigantic anthology that floats fragments of hundreds of authors. Byzantines copied Stobaeus a lot. Those fragments now anchor entire subfields called fragmentary Greek literature. The Etymologicum Magnum in the 12th century gathered lexical notes, etymologies, and cultural trivia. The Byzantines loved a good index. In law and administration, the empire curated just as aggressively. Justinian's Corpus Juris remained a living text, glossed, epitomized, and excerpted through centuries. Noma canons blended canon law with civil law. Ecloga, in the 8th century, attempted legal reform. Basilica, around 900, reorganized Justinianic law into Greek. That Greek basilica ensured that law remained legible to Greek-speaking bureaucrats, not trapped behind Latin. When Anerius and the Glossators in Bologna began teaching Roman law in the 11th century, they used Latin texts that had circulated in Italy all along. But the prestige and coherence of Roman legality existed in part because Constantinople kept the whole enterprise alive and dignified. 1,000 court cases, 1,000 land contracts, and 1,000 canon law disputes kept medieval Greek scribes copying law books with the same energy they applied to Euripides. The empire's bookstores were monasteries. Mount Athos, founded under imperial patronage in 963, grew into a peninsula-wide library system with copy rooms that hummed like monkish print shops. The Studite rule valued writing as labor. The Hojigan Monastery in Constantinople produced manuscripts. The patriarchal school kept grammarians employed. Scribes left notes that sound modern in the most human way. They complained about cramped margins, celebrated finishing long texts, and sometimes admitted errors. They wrote their names. Erethus's hand can be recognized in certain codices. Demetrios Triclinios in the 14th century edited Pindar, Sophocles, and Euripides with a philologist's temperament that modern editors respect. The chain of people is knowable. Their careers can be tracked through marginal notes and scholarly gossip. Byzantine scholars did not limit themselves to copying. They solved problems that text transmission created. Greek orthography drifted. They fixed it. Old scripts felt heavy. They invented minuscule. Access was fragile. They created epitomes. Knowledge was scattered. They built encyclopedias. Their curriculum created infrastructure. The grammar textbooks of Theodosius of Alexandria, and later Manuel Mosopoulos trained copyists to hear the language correctly. Their commentaries standardized interpretation. Theodosius's canons of grammar and Herodian's treatises on accents, copied and recited in Constantinople, kept Greek from unraveling as a written language, that is, infrastructure, as robust as an aqueduct. Science in Byzantium used scaffolding. The empire did not build many new Archimedes-grade treatises, but it did not forget how to read them. The Almagest lived as a reference book. Tables of signs and chords travelled into Byzantine astronomy. Nikephoros Gregoras in the 14th century proposed calendar reform, calculating solar and lunar cycles with an accuracy that prefigured the Gregorian reform of 1582. Leo the mathematician's mechanical curiosities kept pneumatics alive. Hero of Alexandria did not end with the Romans. His books survived in Greek and Arabic, and the Byzantine court's automata made sure the tradition stayed visible. The Geoponica, compiled under Constantine WWII, digested agricultural wisdom from ancient sources. Farmers who never touched a codex still benefited when a courtier summarized older agronomy into a handbook. Not everything glittered, but the pipeline worked. Literature in Byzantine eyes was alive, not antique. They imitated, paraphrased, and commented without shame. Ancient texts served as teacher, ornament, and ammunition. The atticizing style of high Byzantine prose deliberately imitated classical Greek, which later readers mocked as pedantic. Modern scholars like Nigel Wilson see a culture with long memory, turning memory into social capital. When a scholar like Sellos paraded Plato, he was not escaping into the past. He was building a resume. When Anna Komnene staged her history inside a Homeric frame, she was staking her family's name on the gravitas of that canon. That cultural strategy insisted on continuity. It became a palace policy and a school policy. Disaster tested the policy repeatedly. The Arab conquests in the 7th century cut the empire in half, including Alexandria, the old library-rich jewel. Iconoclasm in the 8th and 9th centuries cracked religious images and political coalitions. Civil wars and peasant revolts burned more than barns. Earthquakes hit. Fires ate neighborhoods. The empire's resilience depended on the boring parts. Taxes, grammar classes, monasteries and scribes. The Macedonian dynasty restored internal order in the late 9th and 10th centuries and poured money and prestige into scholarship. That season, labeled the Macedonian Renaissance by modern historians, is why so many 10th century codices dominate the critical apparatus of ancient authors. Scribes then rebuilt the canon, one book at a time. The First Crusade passed through in 1096, 1097 with cranky pilgrims, and the empire endured. The Komnenian revival in the 12th century connected court culture to classical commentary, producing fresh Aristotle scholarship under Anna Komnene's circle. Michael of Ephesus and others clarified biological texts that scholars in the West would later devour. Then 1204 slammed the city off its hinges. Many of the best manuscripts left. The empire shrank, splintered, returned in 1260, one battered and poorer. Still, the Palaiologan Renaissance of the 13th to 15th centuries pumped out new editions, re-edits, and commentaries. Maximus Planudes compiled the Anthologia Planudia, a version of the Greek anthology that, while flawed and incomplete compared to the Palatine anthology discovered later in Heidelberg, still kept Greek epigram alive in the West. Demetrios Triclinios edited the tragedians with textual acuity. Theodore Metachites wrote essays on philosophy and astronomy. The aesthetic of learned melancholy that runs through late Byzantine literature reads like people aware of their empire's fragility and determined to push the books out of the door before the lights went off. Their hustle worked. Two names: Lens the diaspora, Manuel Chrysalis arrived in Italy and taught Greek in Florence, turning Greek class into a status symbol for ambitious humanists. His students translated Homer and Plato. George of Trebizond and Theodore Gaza translated Aristotle into Latin with ferocious speed, fueling debates in 15th century universities about nature and ethics. Cardinal Bessarion hunted manuscripts and encouraged printers. Janus Lascaris travelled on collecting missions for Lorenzo de' Medici, returning with trunks full of Greek books for the Laurentian Library in Florence. Demetrios Chalkokondyles edited the first printed Homer in 1488. Marcus Masurus corrected Greek type at Aldus's shop and wrote elegant prefaces that became literary events. The printed Renaissance in Greek was a team sport with Byzantine all-stars. Medicine delivers another hard number payoff. Paul of Aegina's 7th century epitome of medicine survived widely in Greek and became a standard in Arabic translation. Islamic physicians like al-Zirawi and Ibn Sina drew on Greek materials that Byzantine and Syriac scholars had preserved and systematized. When the West rediscovered ancient medicine, much of it came through the Arabic route and then hit Greek straight on, with the Greek text reshaping future editions. The chain of custody looks like a global conveyor belt. Byzantium ran the belt in one massive middle segment. The philological details matter because they blow away myths. The Venetus A 10th century Byzantine manuscript of the Iliad, kept in Venice's Biblioteca Marciana, contains ancient scholars derived from Alexandrian scholars like Aristarchus. That means a 10th century scribe in Constantinople copied, with care, comments from 2 and 8th century B scholars. The chain spans over 1,000 years without snapping. The 10th century Plato codices tied to Arathis carry a textual tradition that modern editors prioritize. The 10th century codices of Aeschylus and Sophocles of Aeschylus and Sophocles of first-tier witnesses. Those dates repeat because the Macedonian revival created a cultural factory. The wall that later historians tried to build between late antiquity and the Renaissance collapses under the weight of those pages. Some of the preservation looked like organized cheating. Byzantine epitomes of historians took entire books and reduced them to digestible summaries. Excerpts saved scrapbooks of key speeches. That strategy cuts and pastes the past into the needs of the present. A pure antiquarian would cringe. A civilization with risk management smiles. The excerpt of Constantiniana pull passages from Priscus on embassies to Attila, from Polybius on political virtues, and from a zoo of now-lost histories. Those cuts sit in later manuscripts, safe by accident, because a bored courtier had a job. The Suda swallowed entire biographies into its definitions. Eustathius fed ancient glosses into his lecture notes. Byzantium built redundancy into its system. Redundancy in preservation is what kept Archimedes alive inside a prayer book. Even the small, nerdy bits carry dramatic weight. Stichometry, the practice of counting lines to ensure textual integrity, shows up in colophons. A scribe might note that a work contains so many stichoi and that their copy matched the count. That is a checksum from the Middle Ages. The diothotes, the corrector, checked the copy against a model and fixed errors. The Byzantines invented minuscule, but they also preserved the system of accents and breathings that let modern students learn ancient Greek pronunciation. They employed catenae that compiled patristic commentary into chains around biblical texts, a method that also shows up around Homer and Pindar. Those catenae sometimes quote full passages from lost ancient commentators. A modern editor of Aristotle, Homer, or Pindar still wades through Byzantine scholia to reconstruct the ancient debate. Unexpected wins dot the map. Diophantus's Arithmetica survives in a 13th century Greek manuscript that Maximus Planudes worked with, a direct line to the later problem that Fermat scribbled his last theorem about. The Greek anthology owes Planudes for visibility, even though later discoveries improved the text. Strabo's geography survives through Byzantine copying and excerpting. Procopius's secret history survived because someone in a Byzantine scriptorium copied a text that criticized an emperor and then kept it in a cupboard anyway. The survival of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations rests mainly on a single manuscript associated with Aretha's Circle. The historical memory of the early Roman Empire, in Greek, runs through Byzantine codices of Cassius Dio and Appian. The astronomy of Ptolemy passed through Greek, survived alongside Arabic developments, and re-entered Europe through printed editions edited by Greek and Latin teams. The continuity is less a straight line and more like braided rivers that cross and recross. No one in Constantinople thought they were saving Western civilization for future coffee table books. They thought they were maintaining Roman culture, earning status in a hierarchical city, and pleasing God by stewarding talents. The emperors poured money into buildings like the Chalke Gate and the Magnora, set salaries for teachers, and endowed monasteries with land where parchment could be sourced. The patriarch and the court fought, reconciled, fought again, and through all the drama, the scribes kept scraping. The city's landscape reinforced the script. People walked past Hagia Sophia and felt power that once belonged to Augustus, now affirming the creed of Nicene Christianity. But they also walked past statues of Hercules, dragged from pagan temples and set up as art. The hippodrome carried bronze horses that lived multiple lives, including a detour to Venice after 1204. Those horses watched as crowds cheered chariots and staged political arrests. They watched as scholars haggled over copies of Aristotle in a side street. They watched as copyists carried quires of vellum between binders and classrooms. The humor in all this comes from how unglamorous so much of the saving was. 1,000 headaches about ligatures saved Sophocles, a monk in a cold room in Bithynia, prevented the loss of Euclid by refusing to skip a gathering of quires. A court official preserved a century of Greek history by ordering an excerpt volume to train his staff. A scribe used stichometry because he feared a supervisor more than he feared the passage of time. A noble with more ambition than land bribed a teacher to pound Attic grammar into a teenager. That teenager grew up to fund a manuscript of Plato. Surprise, a republic survived because of a republic of letters. The line can be traced through scholars and through walls. The Theodosian walls protected a city that protected books. In 1453, Mehmed II took the city with cannons that made old walls look like nostalgia. He also loved books. He took Greek scholars into the Ottoman court, built libraries, and collected manuscripts in a tradition that later produced magnificent Ottoman libraries. Yet the economic gravity of Italy pulled a flood of Greek texts to Venice, Florence, and Rome. The Renaissance made them famous. Aldus Manutius printed portable octavos in Greek, and the dream of a print-era library became a middle-class fantasy. That dream stands on Byzantine labor, with parchment and pen. Authors and editors continue to name the names and fill in the footnotes. The Oxford Dictionary of Byzantium, edited by Alexander Kazdan, gives encyclopedic treatments of the scholars mentioned here. Averell Cameron's work lays out the politics of cultural continuity. Anthony Caldelis insists that Roman identity and Greek culture fused in the medieval empire, a necessary mental adjustment that transforms how readers value its libraries. Nigel Wilson tracks manuscript pedigrees from Constantinople to Florence with forensic thoroughness. Dimitri Gutas maps the channels between Greek and Arabic. Reviel Netz and William Noel walk readers through the forensic science that resurrected Archimedes. These scholars and their colleagues are the post-game analysts explaining a win that took 1,000 seasons. Specific manuscripts make the continuity visible. The Venatus A of Homer sits in Venice with its dense scholia, a visible fossil of Alexandrian scholarship, transplanted into a 10th century Constantinopolitan volume. The Laurentian Codex of Sophocles in Florence owes its existence to a 11th century Byzantine copyist who chose to include all 7 plays. The Medicius Codex of Aeschylus, also in Florence, is a 10th century manuscript with corrections that reveal a Byzantine editor's hand. The Eurythes Plato codices tie the survival of the dialogues to a bishop with expensive taste in books. The Ptolemaic texts survived through both Greek and Arabic roots, with Byzantine copies anchoring Greek lines, and Islamic astronomers developing the theory that would later challenge Ptolemy on geocentrism. The Archimedes palimpsest, now conserved at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore after its 1998 sale, delivered the most dramatic proof that the engine of preservation in Byzantium worked exactly as described. The empire's education policy also kept people trained to handle tough text. The grammar teacher taught accentuation rules. The rhetorician taught composition by imitation. Students performed progymnasmata, rhetorical exercises that required rewriting fables, condensing stories, and composing arguments. That training created minds able to abridge histories without butchering key content. It created ears sensitive to textual errors. When a scholar like Demetrios Triclinios corrected a corrupt line in Sophocles, he did it with tools hammered into him by centuries of curriculum. That continuity of method matters as much as the pages themselves. Technology never lost the starring role. The switch from papyrus rolls to the codex took place long before Byzantium, but the codex ruled on Byzantine desks. The format made it possible to create multi-work anthologies and to shuffle texts around for excerpt volumes. Bindings improved. Quire structures standardized. Margins became spaces for commentary, the bones that hold up the muscle of text. Iron gall ink left brown traces that can still be read a millennium later. Pointed styluses ruled lines into parchment, so script stayed straight. These details sound artisanal. They add up to a production system in a city that also managed shipping, timetables, grain distributions, land taxes, and military rosters. Book production slotted into an empire that took paperwork seriously. Science threaded through all those shelves. John Philoponus' critiques of Aristotle traveled into Arabic through the Greek-Syriac-Arabic translation nexus, and then back into Latin debates in the 13th century. Later, Byzantine scholars read astronomical tables that translated into computed calendars. Physicians copied drug recipes that originated with Dioscorides. Chorographers played with maps derived from Ptolemy and augmented them with local data. The environment was not a lab bench and a petri dish. It was a reading room with a carefully maintained catalogue. Numbers reveal scale. The Suda contains roughly 30,000 entries. Photius Bibliotheca summarizes and assesses around 280 works. Constantine Vi's Excerpta originally ran to 53 thematic volumes, though only portions survive. The Basilica filled 60 books of reorganized Justinian law. The Almagest's Greek manuscripts trace through dozens of Byzantine copies. Mount Athos holds over 15,000 manuscripts, many of them copied in Byzantine centuries. The Vatican has more than 3,000 Greek codices. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France, nearly as many. The Marciana Library in Venice holds hundreds of Greek manuscripts of Byzantine origin, including the Venatus A. Those figures translate into something larger than a handful of rescue missions. They describe an archive culture. The empire's religious culture sometimes seemed to run against open curiosity, yet many of its most effective guardians of classical knowledge were monks and bishops. Arethusa commissioned Plato. Maximus Planides wore a habit and compiled mathematical texts. Theodore the Studite enforced discipline that fed the scriptorium. God and grammar partnered well when both sides got what they wanted. The iconoclast debates turned fierce over images. The lesson they left behind was not anti-image dogma, but a bureaucracy that could still write and enforce law, arrange logistics, and run schools while elites argued theology. The scribes grumbled, then copied. Modern readers sometimes reach for a simple story, where the West lost the classical world and the Arabs saved it. That story erases Byzantium. It also insults all three. The more accurate picture has multiple arcs. Byzantium preserved, copied, and summarized the Greek canon from Homer to Galen. The Islamic world translated, tested, extended, and taught a canon, adding algebra, new observation, and fresh instruments. Latin Europe first re-encountered antiquity through Arabic translations, and then, in the 14th and 15th centuries, through Greek texts arriving from Byzantium with teachers who could read them. Venice printed, Paris catalogued, Oxford summarized. The map looks like an airline chart where Constantinople is a major hub that stays open for 1,000 years. That length of time deserves emphasis. The empire began in the 4th century and fell in 1453. Its scribes copied Homer in the 10th century. Its scholars edited Euripides in the 14th. Its legal digest from the 6th governed lawsuits in Byzantine courts until the end. Its codices left for Italy in the 15th and met printing presses in the next decade. The continuity runs across a millennium in which kings rose and fell, languages drifted, and technology changed. Continuity on that scale never happens by accident. It happens because a culture chooses to invest in memory. Byzantium chose. The image that remains is crisp. A monk in Constantinople, around 950, bends over a clean sheet of parchment and copies lines from the Iliad. In the margins he writes, Scholia, that quote Alexandrian scholars from 1,000 years earlier. He uses minuscule. His hand is quick but careful. He counts stitchoi. He leaves a colophon that blesses the reader. In the next room, a bureaucrat works through the Excerpta Constantiniana, arranging sections on embassies for a volume that will help future diplomats. In another quarter, a physician copies Paul of Aegine's epitome. Across the city, the patriarch Photius flips through books and writes notes that, centuries later, will be the only surviving summaries of certain ancient works. Outside, fishermen shout prices. Inside, volumes accumulate. The empire has turned its bureaucracy into a preservation machine. The story closes with a crash, and then a whisper. In 1453, the crash we all know arrives. Cannons tear through the Theodosian wall. The city falls. The empire is gone. Yet the whisper outlasts the crash. In Venice, printers set Greek type. In Florence, scholars edit tragedies. In Basel, humanists collate manuscripts. In Paris, cataloguers build collections. In Oxford, college libraries stock Greek codices. The whisper echoes through classrooms where students slog through accents and breathings. It echoes in laboratories where someone reads Euclid's proof in Elements Book I. It hums in law schools where Roman law vocabulary slips into the lecture. In Baltimore, a 10th century copy of Archimedes, photographed under ultraviolet light, coughs up the geometry of a brain that died 2,000 years ago. The continuum held. The joke lands neatly. A city mocked as decadent, superstitious, and antique did the most modern thing a culture can do. It stored knowledge in redundant formats, standardized access, trained its staff, and outsourced at the right moment. The faces vanish. The pages survive. The arc from Photius to Bessarion, from Staudios to Aldus, from minuscule to movable type, proves less an accident and more a policy. Byzantium preserved ancient knowledge because it treated the past as a living portfolio. The dividends still pay. Next, let's turn our attention to the life of Emperor Hirohito, Japan's WWII leader. He collected jellyfish and ended a world war with a scratchy record. He shook hands with MacArthur in a room where the furniture looked like it feared him, then shook Mickey Mouse's hand in Anaheim while wearing a VHS-era suit. The world called him Hirohito. His own country called him the Showa Emperor. And for 62 years, from 1926 to 1989, he sat at the center of Japan's most whiplash century. Empire, catastrophe, surrender, democracy, the economic miracle, and a farewell carried live on television. The story opens on April 29th, 1901, in Tokyo, when a small future emperor entered a world that expected him to be both a living god and a well-behaved schoolboy. He grew up in the Gakushuin Peers School, memorizing Chinese classics and naval specs with equal enthusiasm. He learned to ride, to salute, and to keep a face so neutral it could have been fashioned by a sculptor afraid of controversy. He was given a microscope and fell in love with what he saw. The heir to a sword-waving military culture developed a lifelong, very specific crush on hydroids and jellyfish. His science, nerd energy never dimmed. Then he hopped a ship. In March 1921, as Crown Prince, he sailed to Europe, the first Japanese heir to do it. He shook hands with George V, sat in a box at the Royal Opera House, smiled politely through French protocol, and did the tours every foreign dignitary does. Museums, war cemeteries, naval docks. His diary from that spring reads like a quiet tourist who kept accidentally walking into history. He watched the British constitutional monarchy in action and took notes that would matter later. The UK treated their king like a symbol with tasteful luggage. Japan treated theirs like a sacred engine with a sword. He came home in the fall of 1921 and immediately got handed a job no one really wants. His father, Emperor Taisho, was increasingly ill, and in November 1921, the Crown Prince became regent at age 20. On December 27, 1923, a young radical named Namba Daisuke stepped out at Toranomon and fired at the regent's carriage. Bullet missed. The crowd did not. Namba was seized, tried, and executed a year later. Hirohito stayed impassive. He was already learning the strangest part of imperial life. Everyone wanted something from him, and several wanted him gone entirely. He got married in 1924 to Princess Nagako, later Empress Kojin. They would have 7 children. The future Akihito arrived on December 23, 1933. Future Crown Prince, future Emperor Heisei. Another son, Masahito, arrived in 1935. Daughters Shigeko, Kazuko, Atsuko, and Takako framed the family photos that looked like postcards from an alternate 1930s where militarism never happened. Behind those smiles sat a government cabinet and a military command that accelerated into conflict. On December 25th, 1926, Emperor Taisho died, and Hirohito became the 124th Emperor of Japan. The Showa era began. Showa means enlightened harmony. The 1930s then looked at that name, shrugged, and did the exact opposite. His enthronement ceremony took place in Kyoto on November 10, 1928, with brilliant robes, ancient rites, and headlines that said enlighten harmony in a font that could not predict Mukden, Shanghai, Nanjing, or Pearl Harbor. He wore the layers of tradition, like a person who couldn't get out of a sweater by himself. He had the throne. What he didn't have was a peaceful decade. The decade pivoted on steel rails. On September 18th, 1931, officers of the Kuomintang Army staged the Mukden incident in Manchuria. They blew up a section of railway and claimed Chinese sabotage. Then they invaded Manchuria without asking the civilian government, because governance started to mean less than momentum. Tokyo's leadership, including the emperor, faced an awful calculation. Punishing the army threatened civil war. Approving the conquest threatened international isolation. The expansion won. He approved the imperial sanction that made it official. By March 1932, the puppet state of Manchukuo existed on maps and in U.S. diplomatic protests. The League of Nations sent the Lytton Commission. It returned saying Manchukuo was not legitimate. Japan walked out of the League in March 1933. That walkout became a symbol. A great power turning its back on the rules while insisting it was still civilized. He pursued two passions simultaneously: military briefings and marine biology papers. In Tokyo, a biological laboratory was installed in the palace grounds. He examined hydroids from Sagami Bay under bright lamps that made everything look like a specimen. Colleagues later noted that he published detailed monographs on hydrozoa around Sagami Bay in the 1930s and later decades, sponsoring classical taxonomic work with obsessive care. Scholars have catalogued dozens of papers attributed to his biological pursuits. While ministers argued over oil, he sometimes wrote about tentacles. The contrast did not go unnoticed, then or now. He also experienced personal danger. On January 8, 1932, Lee Bong-chan, a Korean independence activist, threw a bomb at the imperial procession near the Sakura-damen Gate. The explosion wounded bystanders and police horses. The emperor was unhurt. Tokyo tightened security and loosened patience. That same year, naval officers assassinated Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi in the May 15th incident. Punishments stayed light. The lesson absorbed by extremists felt obvious. Violence worked. Then came 1936. The February 26th incident was not a back-page conspiracy. Several hundred soldiers from the 1st Division stormed central Tokyo on a snowy morning, murdered key officials, and tried to force a national reorganization under their preferred ideology. The emperor's reaction came fast and hard. He demanded suppression. He refused the rebels' manifestos and called the insurrection outrageous in the language of court that still found ways to sound volcanic. According to Koichi Kido's diary and contemporary testimonies, he threatened to personally lead loyal troops if the army hesitated to restore order. No one wanted the emperor in a tank. Loyal forces crushed the rebellion within days. Trials followed. Executions followed. A myth cracked. The idea of a passive emperor who always bent to military will took a serious hit right there. The army still controlled too much. But in 1936, the palace had drawn a red line, and everyone saw it. The China War blew past that line in 1937. A skirmish at the Marco Polo Bridge on July 7th escalated into full war within days. The government had no prepared off-ramp, no credible plan, and no honest sense of what escalation would cost. He sanctioned the war effort. At this point, the historians divide. Herbert Bix, in his Pulitzer-winning Hirohito and the Making of Modern Japan, 2000, paints him as an active participant who signed off on campaigns and rewarded generals, despite knowing the consequences. Noriko Kawamura, in Emperor Hirohito and the Pacific War, 2015, emphasizes his constraints and his efforts to limit disasters once the war machine rolled. Both agree on the basics. He was not a puppet. He had agency, and he exercised it in key moments, even if he also defaulted to caution and consensus. The worst episode in China became synonymous with imperial violence. Nanjing fell on December 13th, 1937. Over the following weeks, Japanese soldiers committed mass killings, widespread sexual violence, and looting. The death toll remains a source of debate, with reputable estimates ranging from 100,000 to over 200,000 killed. Hirohito decorated several commanders afterward, including General Iwani Matsui, who was later hanged by the Tokyo Tribunal. Documents like the Kido diaries and staff records show the emperor received reports about discipline problems and atrocities throughout the China War. He expressed dissatisfaction at times with army excess, then continued to sanction operations. That pattern of misgivings without decisive correction has fueled arguments about his responsibility ever since. While bombs fell on Chinese cities, he kept reading naval memos over breakfast. He sat with chiefs of the army and navy staff, pressed for details that reveal a mind less mystical and more managerial than the stereotype. Diaries by Chief of Army General Staff Hajime Sugiyama and others show a monarch who asked about troop strengths, timelines, and supply. In September 1941, according to the Sugiyama Memorandum, he challenged army optimism and asked specific questions about logistics and duration if war broke out against the United States and Britain. His skepticism did not translate into a veto. The tripartite pact with Germany and Italy had been signed in September 1940. By late 1941, oil imports had been slashed by embargo. Japan had imported roughly 80% of its oil from the United States. The American freeze on Japanese assets in July 1941 and the subsequent embargo meant stockpiles that could sustain operations for perhaps 2 years at best. That clock ticked inside every meeting. Imperial conferences formalized the path to war. On September 6, 1941, the leadership decided to prepare to go to war if negotiations with the United States stalled. On November 5th, an imperial conference approved war plans while giving diplomats a final chance to settle. On December 1st, the conference authorized hostilities. He sanctioned. The record is clear on that point. He did not write the attack plan for Pearl Harbor. He did not personally pick Battleship Row. He also did not stop what everyone in the room knew was coming. The myth that the emperor was just a ceremonial stamp. Ignoring strategy evaporates in these minutes. He read the papers. He understood the stakes. He sanctioned anyway. December 7th, 1941, local date in Hawaii, turned him into the wartime sovereign of a world conflict empire. 353 Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor in 2 waves. 8 U.S. battleships took hits. 4 sank. Nearly all were later raised. 2,403 Americans died. 1,178 were wounded. Japan lost 29 planes and 5 midget submarines with 64 men dead. The same day, Japanese forces hit the Philippines, Malaya, and Hong Kong. He received reports delivered on trays, in rooms where lacquer shone and silence stuck to the ceiling. For months, the news ran hot. Hong Kong fell on December 25th. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered on February 15th, 1942, with over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops taken prisoner. Manila fell on January 2nd. British battleships, Prince of Wales, and Repulse lay at the bottom. The empire expanded so fast, mapmakers bruised their wrists colouring fresh red. He did not deliver Churchillian radio addresses. He wore a uniform with the gold braid of a marshal of the army and navy, and presided over victory parades in ideas, if not in person. He took on the ritual role of supreme commander of the Imperial General Headquarters and blended ceremony with command in ways that were uniquely Japanese. Westerners sometimes missed it and called it all figurehead. The documents from the time say otherwise. The tide turned at Midway, June 4th to 6, 1942. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akaga, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were sunk by U.S. Kaga dive bombers. The Japanese lost around 248 aircraft and over 3,000 men, including many of their best pilots. He received the news, changed nothing about his composure, and kept going. Sources trace his response to a cavalry officer's fatalism and a scientist's interest in systems. He accepted setbacks as data points. He did not invite dissent to lunch. From 1943 forward, he faced a new reality. Retreat sold as maneuver, attrition sold as spirit. Saipan fell on July 9th, 1944, putting U.S. bombers within range of Tokyo. That loss triggered something close to a political intervention. He prodded Tojo Hideki, the prime minister who wore too many hats, partly off the stage. Tojo resigned on July 18th, 1944. Kyozo Kuniaki replaced him. Army and Navy chiefs rotated out. War Minister Anami Korechika would later become crucial. As the bombs started to land on the home islands, the emperor began meeting the Big Six leaders more often. He asked questions. He calculated public mood. He made the kind of incremental changes that looked small and carried enormous implications. On March 9th, 1945, Tokyo burned. 279 B-29s dropped incendiaries. That created a firestorm. About 100,000 people died in one night. 16 square miles of the city vanished into ash. John Dowers, embracing defeat, notes that bodies lay in canals that boiled. He toured damaged sites in a sedan, wearing a business suit, watching his capital smolder. Air raids took Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka. Okinawa's A2 day battle killed over 12,000 American soldiers, more than 100,000 Japanese troops, and tens of thousands of civilians. The army pushed Ketsu-go, the decisive homeland battle plan, and readied civilians with bamboo spear drills and grim slogans. The Prime Minister in April 1945, Suzuki Kantaro, favored an end to the war but could barely move the army. Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori sought Soviet mediation. Prince Kone Fumimaro, a former Prime Minister, warned of communist revolution if the war continued. Koichi Kido's diary shows his private pleadings with the emperor to break the stalemate. July 26, 1945, the Potsdam Declaration demanded Japan's unconditional surrender, while leaving the future of the emperor ambiguous. The government stalled. The press used mokusatsu, literally, to ignore or withhold comment, which read as refusal to Allied ears. On August 6th, a uranium bomb detonated over Hiroshima. The instantaneous death toll reached tens of thousands. By year's end, radiation and injuries raised the number to an estimated 140,000. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with about 1.5 million soldiers. On August 9th, a plutonium bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Estimates for the 1945 casualties in Nagasaki by year's end range, around 40,000 to 70,000. The timing of surrender decisions has fueled debates for decades. Noriko Kawamura and Richard Frank, among others, stressed that Soviet entry closed the last diplomatic exit and astonished the leadership. The bombs, the Soviet invasion, and the strangulation by blockade coalesced into a single terrible picture. On the night of August 9th, the senior leadership split on whether to accept the Potsdam terms with a reservation about preserving the Kokutai. The national polity centered on the emperor. The vote tied. He broke it. The so-called sacred decision committed Japan to seek surrender with the Kokutai condition attached. The Allies replied, clarifying that the emperor would be subject to the supreme commander of Allied powers. He accepted anyway. The coup came next. The Kaozhou incident unfolded in the early hours of August 15th. Army officers led by Major Kenji Hatanaka tried to seize the palace and prevent the surrender broadcast. They sought the recording of the imperial rescript that Hirohito had made earlier in the day. At NHA, loyal troops, palace staff, and senior officers thwarted them with a mix of firmness and deliberate confusion. The surrender discs, 78 revolutions per minute records, were hidden in the palace and survived the search. Hatanaka failed, fled, and shot himself near the imperial palace shortly after dawn. The broadcast went out at noon. The emperor's voice, high and unfamiliar to a population that had never heard it, announced the end. The speech used court Japanese, obscure to many, and included a phrase that survives in every history textbook: to endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable. People cried in kitchens. Some prostrated themselves before radios. Some had no idea what the archaic phrasing had actually said until someone translated it into everyday words. The silence after 10 p.m. held the weight of 14 years of war in China and the Pacific. He met General Douglas MacArthur on September 27, 1945, at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. Two men stood for a photograph that would travel further than any imperial portrait had ever traveled. MacArthur wore an open collar and looked like the world's most confident beach dad. The emperor wore a tailcoat that had never been within 4,000 miles of a beach. The power dynamics were obvious in the picture and complicated behind the scenes. MacArthur decided not to indict him. Partly it was pragmatism. He calculated that keeping the emperor on the throne would stabilize the occupation and blunt left-wing revolution. Partly it was fiction writing by policy team. SCAP staff actively curated a narrative of a peaceful sovereign misled by militarists. Herbert Bix and John Dower both unpack how this was constructed, sometimes literally, through press directives. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East indicted 28 leaders. Hideki Tojo took the weight and the gallows. The emperor remained. He provided carefully shaped testimony through intermediaries. He visited schools and hospitals. He waved to cheering crowds who had been starved for any good news that did not involve fire. On January 1st, 1946, he issued the Humanity Declaration. It renounced the myth of the emperor as a living god in the deadpan court, phrasing of a bureaucratic thunderclap. It stated that bonds between emperor and people were not based on divinity. It did not renounce the throne. It did not repudiate every Shinto association. It was a political reset, written in polite kanban. The 1947 Constitution, enacted on May 3rd, codified him as the symbol of the state and of the unity of the people. He lost any formal political power. He gained the role of national mascot and historical lightning rod. He adjusted by being seen. He toured the country with Empress Kojun, visiting bombed-out towns and winning hearts with a wave that was part apology, part continuity. Old footage shows him on train platforms wearing a hat that said post-war humility in silent movie text. He rode through muddy rurals in cars that looked too clean, offering sympathetic nods to farmers who were trying to grow wheat where factories had been. He also kept returning to marine biology. The Imperial Household Laboratory resumed work. He wrote, he published, he sponsored taxonomical monographs on marine invertebrates, including the hydroids of Sagami Bay, published under the auspices of the Biological Laboratory of the Imperial Household. He examined specimens with a care that would have made his generals nervous if they had possessed that kind of patience. He watched as 7 of those modernizations hit headlines. In 1959, Crown Prince Akihito married Michiko Shoda, a commoner, and the world cooed like it had just discovered the Japanese monarchy contained actual people. He opened the 1964 Tokyo Olympics and cut ribbons like construction projects were emotional therapy. In 1971, he toured Europe as a peacetime monarch. Then in 1975, he visited the United States, where someone decided to take him to Disneyland. There are photos, the Showa Emperor and Empress Kojun on the monorail, on the Mark Twain riverboat, nodding as animatronics explained America to an emperor who had once sanctioned Pearl Harbor. The Saturn V had already flown by then. He still preferred the jellyfish. He visited Hiroshima in 1947 and faced quiet hostility. He visited Okinawa in 1975 and faced loud protests 50 years after the war started in China and 30 years after Okinawa's obliteration. Some people refused to clap. They remembered artillery and cave massacres and asked, without asking, where responsibility lived. He did not answer publicly. He kept the monarchy's new role. Never say anything that cannot fit on a ribbon. Inside the palace, he watched politics blow past him. The Liberal Democratic Party built and ran a machine that delivered the economic miracle. He cut ribbons for highways and bullet trains. He presided over the Showa era's contradictions. A pacifist constitution paired with a self-defense force, a society that worked 12-hour days to become rich and then used its vacations to nap, an emperor who was both everywhere and nowhere in policy conversations. He stopped visiting Yasukuni Shrine after 1975, and a 2006 statement by Tomohiko Tomita, a late Grand Steward of the Imperial Household Agency, revealed notes indicating he objected to the enshrinement of convicted Class A war criminals in 1978. The notes quote the emperor expressing displeasure and stating that is why he stopped visiting. It was a rare flash of explicit judgment from a man taught to speak like a cloud. The war did not stop being litigated. Japanese historians like Ikuhiko Hata and foreign scholars like Bix, Dower, Kamura, and Richard Frank have argued for decades over the emperor's role and responsibility. Some point to the 1946 monologue, transcribed by aides and published decades later, where he recounted his version of events to occupation officers, minimizing his role in decisions while highlighting moments of caution. Others point to the Sugiyama memo, the Kido diaries, and the notes of Navy and Army chiefs like Nagano Asami and Yunai Mitsumasa, which show an emperor engaged in the details of both China and Pacific campaigns. The record shows him praising aggressors when victories came and urging discipline when world opinion suffered. It shows him replacing ministers and chiefs, sometimes with explicit prodding. It shows him breaking the deadlock for surrender in August 1945, a move that saved lives by the hundreds of thousands. It also shows him presiding over a regime that brought mass death to China and Southeast Asia before that decision arrived. The ledger refuses to simplify. He died on January 7, 1989, at the age of 87. His reign lasted 62 years, Japan's longest, spanning from the last emperors of Europe through the Sony Walkman. Newspapers that had once printed his portrait next to war decrees printed it next to articles about the bubble economy popping. Mourners lined the streets. The Showa era closed. The Heisei era opened with Akihito's accession. People measured their lives by the sign on the calendar and recalibrated their memories around a single, complicated shadow. The myths cling to him because he makes myths easy. The idea of a powerless puppet clears the conscience of people who prefer villains they can see and oppose. The idea of an omnipotent mastermind clears the logic of historians who want clean narratives. He was neither. The imperial institution in interwar Japan was a spiderweb of rituals and procedures that gave the emperor enormous legal authority and thick cultural power, while also pushing decisions toward consensus among a small elite. He worked within that system, shaped it in crisis, and let it shape him most of the time. His signature stood on war orders and rescripts. His voice stood against certain coups. His curiosity stood over aquariums. He lived with contradictions and made the country live with them too. The humor at his expense tends to start with those marine specimens. A war emperor who loved jellyfish is not a punchline written by a comedian in 2024. It is archival reality. The biological laboratory of the imperial household published catalogues of hydrozoans that any taxonomist would respect. Scientists still cite Hydrozoa of Sagami Bay from the mid-century work of the Imperial Lab. The palace maintained aquaria that staff remembered with fond exasperation. A grand marshal of the army fretted about salinity. There are few errors where the world's most famous figurehead could tell you the difference between companularity and circularity while reading casualty counts from Guadalcanal. His most famous photograph remains the one with MacArthur, because it captures the two halves of Japan's 20th century. The general who looked like a poster took the war and turned it into the occupation that rewired Japan, from land reform and women's suffrage to corporate law and baseball. The emperor who looked like a solemn civilian smuggled his dynasty into a new function. John Dower describes that rewiring with bracing clarity. A defeated nation turned into a lab for democracy, under a banner that kept its dragon, because stability beat purity when the Cold War got cold fast. The archival receipts on August 1945 almost read like a script outlined for a thriller, which is why so many documentaries dramatize it. There is the fragile recording in the middle of the night, the palace lights cut, the misunderstanding in the dark, the phone lines dead, the officer who tries to arrest the head chamberlain, the staff who hide the discs, the soldiers who cannot find what is 3 rooms away, the quiet at noon when the radio buzzes, and the voice, unknown and official, at the same time, asks a nation to stop. There is no need for invented dialogue. The battle reports, the Tokushu Koto memos do all the work. The government that came after learned to live with irony. The emperor opened baseball tournaments at Koshin, while pacifism sat in Article 9. He presided over the announcement of Expo 70 in Osaka, and held court for the world at a fair full of bold shapes and food on sticks. He watched the economic miracle flood Tokyo with neon, while old men in the Diet argued about whether it was safe to blink. He became a grandfather in a monarchy that stopped treating arranged marriage as a policy decision, presiding over a court that let love in, which for a country that once measured bloodlines like a laboratory could register as a revolution. When sources note that he stopped visiting Yasukuni after Class A war criminals were enshrined there in 1978, it reads like a line drawn with elegant caution. The Tomita notes released in 2006 help confirm that hesitation. The man who had once pinned medals on men who did terrible things decided not to pray where their souls were recorded. He did it without a press release, in the style of a monarch, nudging history without leaving fingerprints. The idea that the United States whitewashed him has a foundation in documents. MacArthur's staff actively shaped press narratives. Prosecutors like Joseph Keenan followed policy lead. Some incriminating trails were not followed. The Tokyo trial, legally unsatisfying and factually indispensable, ran from 1946 to 1948 and left emissions big enough to drive a battleship through. It still delivered a historical record that helps fix responsibility. The emperor, kept a symbol, became the focus of a different tribunal that never ended. The one conducted in books and articles and museums, where footnotes function like cross-examination. That tribunal uses math sometimes. The numbers in China dwarfed the Pacific's naval losses. Japan's operations in China from 1937 to 1945 killed millions of Chinese soldiers and civilians. The rape of Nanjing's thousands of victims shaped memory even more than the casualty totals. The bombings of Chongqing, which began in 1938, killed tens of thousands and pioneered tactics later used by both Axis and Allies. The death calculations for the invasion of the home islands, had it happened, run into the millions. Historian Richard Frank's Downfall lays out those numbers. The Soviet entry into the war on August 8 eliminated the last diplomatic bet the Japanese leadership held. The atomic bombings and the firebombing campaign broke cities. The Emperor sits at the center of those equations. He did not launch torpedoes. He authorized a war that led to them. He also ended that war with an improvisation that looks like a paradox and feels like clarity. He broke a tie when the war cabinet was stuck. He recorded a speech that took advantage of a century's first mass technology. He stopped an army coup by being a fixed point in a palace where coups had found gaps before. He put the throne on a new foundation, not divine but symbolic. He changed the job description his great-great-grandchildren would inherit. And then he went back to the lab. One day in Anaheim, in 1975, he rowed a riverboat named after a man who never met him. Under a flag that won, the cameras clicked. He tipped his hat. The country watching at home had a monopoly on awkwardness. He had jellyfish to get back to. The outtakes of his life include odd notes that make every historian smile despite themselves. He used to read battle maps in micro, paying attention to supply depots and rail links, like a man planning a model railroad rather than a campaign. He kept a straight face through ceremonies where hundreds prostrated themselves on marble floors. He learned English and never used it in public. He carried himself in the post-war as if he'd been turned from an absolute monarch into a walking logo and decided to make the logo mean endurance. He refused to be photographed with generals who might look like buddies. He did not flinch when the MacArthur photo stole the narrative. He posed with a baseball team and looked like a professor forced to smile in the faculty lounge. He acted like a man grateful to have survived his own political system. Everything about him resists easy judgment. That does not excuse anything. It lowers the volume on everyone who pretends they have an algorithm. Herbert Bix pushes hard on the culpability and documents show why. John Dower contextualizes the defeat and occupation in a way that makes the survival of the throne look less like a conspiracy and more like a social compromise that worked. Noriko Kawamura connects the dots between his private cautions and his public silences with the care of a surgeon. The Kido diaries, the Shugiyama memo, the Imperial Conference transcripts. These are the calendars on which the war gets written. They build a picture of a leader who could be decisive and passive in alternating frames, who caved momentum until momentum threatened to cave the country, then finally used the power only he had. He remains the most photographed contradiction of the 20th century outside of Winston Churchill's cigar. He wore a marshal's uniform without a single bit of mud and ended a war by breaking a tie. He refused to disavow his own government until the floor fell away. He renounced godhood by reading a statement that felt like a bureaucratic memo. He ran the monarchy as if it were a laboratory for old forms, then stepped aside and let new forms take over. He put Disney on his itinerary like someone trying to make the war years feel like a fever dream. The last images of him in the late 1980s float through Japan's collective memory. A small man, slightly stooped, waving from the window of a car. An emperor, overshadowed by the skyline his nation built after his war destroyed the last one. He had outlived Stalin, Roosevelt, Hitler, Mao, Churchill, de Gaulle, and most of the cabinet that sank the world. He had watched Japan write a constitution that forbade war, then build a military that swore it was not a military, then sell televisions to everybody. He had kept the line of emperors unbroken, since deep in myth, at a cost that history still calculates. The reel that plays forever is the one with the microphone, the scratch of vinyl, the old language, and the hush that fell over a country that had not known silence in years. The voice said, "Stop." The country stopped. A man who loved hydrozoans set down a nation's weapons. The king who once signed orders for invasions traveled to Disneyland. The punchline is history's, not his. The responsibility is his, and history's, and a million other names that matter less and make it easier to blame. The lesson sits in the uneasy space between agency and structure, between abdication of memory and the memory that will not abdicate. You walk through that space in the morning, in Tokyo, on a day when the sky looked like a blank page and the city remembered how to breathe. He walked through it for decades, with a microscope close at hand and a schedule full of ceremonies. He left it without fanfare, because he would. The Showa era ended with page-long obituaries and shelves full of biographies. The jellyfish stayed in their tanks. The archives remained open. The receipts did not burn. The stickiest myths pull people back to the clean lines of legend. He does not give those. He leaves the messy facts. He leaves a country that built its second act better than its first. He leaves explanations that stare at each other until both blink. He leaves a photo with MacArthur that says everything and hides even more. He leaves a palace still full of rituals and a parliament full of noise. He leaves researchers reading memos in the original, line by line, precisely because it matters. He leaves a monarch's job description, scribbled in pencil. Do not rule, symbolize. He leaves a nation that still lives under that sketch. And he leaves the moment that always breaks the room's composure. August 15th, 1945. Noon. The radio cracks. The needle drops. The emperor's voice arrives, thin and formal, over a nation that has forgotten what a normal day sounds like. It is the most consequential record Japan ever made. That is the life of a sovereign who collected jellyfish and turned off a war. Between those 2 points sits the hard history that refuses to be simple, that rewards patience, that punishes slogans, that demands you follow the memos, the diaries, the transcripts. He is both the symbol and the subject. He is the contradiction that adds up. He is the man who stood next to MacArthur and did not blink. He is the one who stepped into Disneyland and did not laugh. He is the hinge. Our journey through history continues with the astronomy and astrology of ancient Egypt. The star that made an empire's calendar didn't sit in a lab or on a spreadsheet. It burned blue-white over the eastern horizon, showing up for a few minutes before dawn after weeks of absence, and it told the Nile when to rise. Astronomers today call it Sirius. Ancient Egyptians called it Sopit. Greek writers labeled it Sothis. A single star became the alarm clock for a civilization. Every time Sopit returned in midsummer, the river followed. Fields drank deep, tax ledgers filled, and the year reset. That annual flash of starlight was the real New Year's ball drop. Minus Times Square, and plus an entire country relying on celestial punctuality. Picture a flat rooftop in Thebes, around 1300 BC. The air cool, incense sweet, a skyline of pylons and palm groves, silhouetted in grey. A priest stands with a plumb-line sight, called a merkhet, under a sky so crystalline it looks freshly polished. He watches for the heliacal rising, the first reappearance of Sopadet, appearing for mere minutes before sunrise, after roughly 70 days hidden in the sun's glare. When the star winks into view, a new year starts. Civil officials shift paperwork. Ritual officials change liturgies. Farmers prepare for Aket, the inundation season. The star told them. The river confirmed it. The bureaucracy handled the rest. This is not a story of fortune cookies and vague horoscopes from the Old Kingdom. It is the story of a culture that taught the sky to run its clocks, stacked temples along axes of sunrise and starrise, and eventually folded Greek zodiac signs into its cosmic playbook when Alexander's heirs ran the country. The astronomy and astrology of ancient Egypt lived as separate siblings, one pragmatic and architectural, the other symbolic and predictive, sharing the same sky and many of the same gods, but not the same job description. Start with the basics, because the Egyptian year did heavy lifting. Their civil calendar ran 365 days, 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 extra days tucked at the end. Those 5 were the epigeminal days, mythologized as birthdays of Osiris, Isis, Seth, Nephthys, and Horus the Elder. The year got carved into 3 seasons tied to the Nile. Aket, inundation. Pare, emergence, / growing. Shemu, harvest. No leap day existed for most of pharaonic history. The civil calendar drifted relative to the solar year by a quarter day annually, which meant a full day of drift every 4 years. Egyptian administrators simply shrugged and kept the paperwork moving. The priesthood tracked reality with the sky in the farmer's sandals. The civil calendar did its own loop every 1,460 civil years. One Sothic cycle. The calendar realigned with the heliacal rising of Sirius, because 1,460x 365 equals 1,461 solar years. Fix by doing nothing approach that only a civilization thinking in centuries could love. That 460-year cycle later became a historian's dream and nightmare. Inscriptions occasionally say something like Year X of King Y. The heliacal rising of Sophis is on day Z of the month. That's not ancient clickbait. It's a timestamp. WWII used those Sothic dates in 1904 to anchor Egyptian chronology. Richard A. Parker fine-tuned it in the mid-20th century. Then, scholarship hit the brakes. The heliacal rising date changes with latitude. Memphis, Thebes, and Elephantine do not share the same sky clock. Haze matters. Observer skill matters. The supposed anchor turned into a bungee cord. Egyptologists now use Sothic dates carefully and locally. Still valuable, just not the absolute cosmic truth. Reality refused to be a single line on a chart. It stayed a star, seen through a particular dawn. The priests, hour watchers, in some texts, weren't just scanning for Sirius. They built a night clock out of stars. The decans were the secret sauce. Imagine the night sliced into 36 star groups, spaced along the ecliptic, each rising consecutively across the night over the course of the year. Decans rise about every 10 days across the calendar. They also rise roughly every 40 minutes across a single night. That created a stellar schedule on a Middle Kingdom coffin lid from about 1700 BC. Diagonal star tables show the decans in slanting columns, the earliest star clocks in Egypt. Neugebauer and Parker published many of these in Egyptian astronomical texts, a foundational source for this entire topic. These tables told a priest which decan would rise, at which hour, in which month. The result? Timekeeping by constellations, with accuracy good enough to coordinate rituals before sunrise. and to tune the pace of verses in the hours of the night, texts that accompanied the sun god's journey through the underworld. Temples backed that precision with hardware. The water clock from Karnak, carved under Amenhotep III around the 14th century Bas, is a stone bucket with sloping sides and internal hour marks. Water drips out at a calibrated rate to mark hours through the night and across the seasons. It's an ancient clepsydra wearing a pharaonic hat. Wonder. Shaped shadow clocks and gnomons managed daylight hours, which were temporal hours, not fixed 60-minute chunks. The day had 12 hours, and the night had 12 hours, regardless of season. Short winter day, each daylight hour shrank. Long summer day, each hour stretched. Time flexed with the sun. That elasticity is both poetic and practical, and it made sense in a world where sunrise and sunset defined the shift change, and the calendar wrote itself across the sky. From star clocks to star gods took no leap. The sky goddess, nut arched over the world, body studded with gold stars. The sun nightly travelled through her and got reborn at dawn. Stellar deities did something similar, but with a different commute. Circling the northern sky, the circumpolar stars never sank below the horizon. Egyptians called them imperishables, often transliterated as Ikhemusek, the ones who do not know destruction. Those stars became the destination for the king's soul in pyramid texts, dating to around 2400 times. 2300 Bath. The pharaoh ascended to join those undying lights. That was cosmology turned into policy. The ruler didn't retire. He relocated to the night sky and kept watching the state. Nighttime constellations wore distinctly Egyptian faces. Orion's figure was Sa, associated with Osiris, lord of the underworld, who also represented fertility and renewal. Sirius was the goddess Sopet, an early form of Isis. Ursa Major, the Big Dipper to modern eyes, turned into Meskhetiyu, the foreleg of a bull, literally a severed ox leg. That makes sense, once the night sky is seen as a mythic butcher's shop. Near it, a pregnant hippo goddess, Rerid or Tarid, floated alongside a crocodile. Anyone hunting for Greek shapes will get lost. Egypt's sky was not a telescoped copy of someone else's imagination. It carried its own cast. Evidence for how the Egyptians used these constellations stretches across ceilings and sarcophagi. Senamut, the ambitious architect and official under Hatshepsut, decorated his tomb, Chiad Carve, and a 53, with an astronomical ceiling about 3,450 years ago. One section shows decans, planets, and star figures. Another features the northern constellations, including the hippo and the bull's foreleg. The tomb of Seti the Wes, K17, carved around 1290 to 1279 Bas, and that of Ramesses VI, K79, around 1145, 1137 Bas, hold some of the most elaborate astronomical ceilings of the New Kingdom. These are not medieval star charts with neat grids, but they absolutely encode observational knowledge linked to timekeeping and ritual. The Book of Nut, an Egyptian treatise preserved in copies from the New Kingdom and later, lays out decans, hours, and the daily and nightly journeys of the sun. None of this looks like modern astronomy. All of it works like it was meant to run a state, and the state ran straight as a plumb line. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, raised around 2550 Bas, stands aligned to true north with an error around 3 arc minutes. So precise that modern surveyors still feel mildly judged. The 4 sides track the cardinal directions better than most of today's backyard sheds. No GPS, no compass, just sky observations with a Mercat and sighting rods on a flat piece of ground. Kate Spence proposed in 2000 that Old Kingdom engineers used a pair of circumpolar stars, Kochab in Ursa Minor and Mizar in Ursa Major, lining them up vertically to find north. The alignment would shift with precession, creating a small, datable offset that roughly matches the pyramid's orientation errors through time. The idea remains debated, but the core message is solid. Egyptians found true north by citing the nightly rotations of circumpolar stars. Architecture bent to astronomy. Inside Khufu's pyramid sit 4 narrow shafts that launched 1,000 documentaries. 2 rise from the king's chamber, 2 from the so-called queen's chamber, and they angle up and down with inclinations around 32 and 45 degrees. Theories claimed they aim at Sirius or Orion's belt to the south and key circumpolar stars to the north. Around 2,500 Burs, Alpha Draconis, Thuban, drifted close to the north celestial pole. Orion's belt and Sirius rose to the south with a predictable geometry. Rudolf Gantenbrink's robotic exploration in 1993 found limestone doors with copper handles blocking the southern Queen's chamber shaft, a tiny cosmic cliffhanger inside stone. The idea that the shaft served as ventilation doesn't hold up, as they were closed at both ends. More plausibly, they symbolically connected the king to the imperishables of the north and to Osiris/Orion and Isis/Sirius in the south. The details of exact alignments remain contentious. Stone isn't perfect, horizons aren't flat, and the shafts aren't laser sight tubes, but the concept fits the texts. The pyramid texts proclaim the king's starward journey. The pyramid gives him the lanes. And yes, the mimetic claim that the 3 Giza pyramids match Orion's belt like a cosmic scale model also refuses to die. It's visually satisfying. It sells beautifully on late-night TV. The problem floats in the data. The spacing isn't consistent. The scale fails across the distances. The angles don't neatly mirror orientation once the curvature of the sky and precessional change get factored. The Nile does not replicate the Milky Way's width or curvature. Monuments sitting involved bedrock, geologistics, previous tombs, and sightlines to Heliopolis. The correlation is a just plausible pattern found after the fact. Meanwhile, the power plant theory needs to meet the fossilized wood fragments in the pyramid, the copper tool marks, and the simple reality that storage chambers and relieving stones do not equal turbines. Ancient engineering was brilliant without being steampunk. Temples extended the sky-to-stone conversation. The foundation ritual, stretching the cord, depicted kings and the goddess Seshat using cords and sighting instruments to align the axes, a scene repeated in inscriptions at Edfu and Dendera. This wasn't ceremonial cosplay. The axes matter. Juan Antonio Belmonte and Mosalam Chaltaut, in a comprehensive survey published around 2009-2010, measured orientations of hundreds of temples and found patterns not attributable to chance. Many axes line up to sunrise or sunset on specific dates, often tied to important festivals or the agricultural cycle. The temple of Amun-Re at Karnak catches the first light at winter solstice along its eastern axis. On that morning, sunlight spears down the central corridor like a slow dagger of gold. Abu Simbel, carved for Ramesses II around 1264 BS, famously lights up the sanctuary twice a year, around late February and late October. Myth attaches those dates to Ramesses' birthday and coronation. The inscriptional evidence doesn't support those exact personal milestones, but the solar effect is real. The alignment sits close to a solar date when built, with shifts explained by precession, calendar drift, and the temple's modern relocation. In the 1960s to escape Lake Nasser, light still walks to the back and lands on statues of the gods. That's the point. Other temples lean towards specific stars. At Philae, the Isis temple's axis plausibly targets the rising of Sirius. During certain centuries, the goddess and the star had fused identities by the late period. At Dendera, the great temple of Hathor watches the sky with a roofline full of zodiacal imagery added under the Ptolemies. Edfu maps myth onto architecture, describing the god Horus founding the temple, aligned to a primordial island, born from Nun's waters. Architectural alignment became theology in stone. The walls insist that the cosmos has grammar, and the temple knows it. Astronomy rolled along for millennia with this rhythm. The sky is clock, the sky is map, the sky is text. Astrology, in the modern sense of casting personal horoscopes with planetary positions in zodiac signs, arrived much later. Egypt had plenty of omen literature and day-by-day luck guides earlier. The Cairo calendar, Papyrus Cairo 86637, from the Ramesside period, roughly 1240–1163 B, lists auspicious and inauspicious days with reasons like good, as the gods rest, or bad, as Seth and Horus fight. That document may even encode the brightness variation of the star, Algol, every 2.85 days, according to a controversial 2015 analysis by Jettus and colleagues. If true, it would be the earliest record of a variable star's period. Mainstream opinion remains cautious, whether that specific claim sticks or not. The broader point stands. Egyptians long connected daily life to cosmic cycles. They simply didn't calculate natal charts with ascendant degrees in the Old or Middle Kingdoms. Personal horoscopes bloomed in Egypt during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, from the late 2nd century B onward. Greek papyri from Oxyrhynchus, Teptunis, and elsewhere preserve horoscope texts giving planetary longitudes, zodiac signs, and ascendants for specific birth dates and hours. The Dendera zodiac, carved around 50 bars, and now in the Louvre thanks to 19th century artifact relocation. Zeal showcases the 12 classic zodiac signs wrapped in a circle, with decans and planets layered in. The brown zodiac is Egyptian stone with Greek constellations, a mashup that narrates the moment perfectly. Egyptian priests adopted Greek horoscopic astrology while maintaining their decanal heritage. Planets became more than wandering stars. They acquired signs, domiciles, terms. A culture famous for calendrical stability found a new timing system and attached it to old gods, because that's Egypt's superpower, absorbing and rebranding. Before those zodiacs went up, the planets were already familiar to temple artists. The astronomical ceilings of Seti I and Ramesses I show the planets as boat-riding deities moving through the sky. Mars was identifiable as the red one. Mercury and Venus appeared near the Sun at certain times. Jupiter and Saturn glided slowly. Exact Egyptian planet names vary across periods and texts, and the iconography sticks close to myth rather than mechanics. There's no evidence that pharaonomic astronomers tracked planetary synodic periods with Babylonian-level numeric precision, though they certainly noticed retrograde motion and the peculiarities of Venus appearing as morning and evening star. The New Kingdom water clock's inscriptions include planet names as nighttime reference points for priests. That anchored practice rather than theory. Minutes measured in drips while a priest watched a red star slide backward against the background. Eclipses were not the main event in Egyptian records before the Hellenistic invasion. The sky over Egypt hosts fewer spectacular total eclipses than modern eclipse chasers would like, and Egyptian textual culture preferred ritual continuity to observational logbooks. Graffiti and omen texts speak of the sky darkening, with mythic interpretations, like the serpent Apep attacking Ra's solar bark. Babylonian astronomical tablets offer the eclipse predictions. Egyptian temples offer the rituals to repel chaos. Once Greek astronomers set up shop in Alexandria, tables and models started coming from Nile-adjacent mines to the entire Mediterranean. That's where Eratosthenes enters, like a boss of measurement. Around 240 BCE, working in Alexandria's library under the Ptolemies. Eratosthenes used reports from Cn, modern Aswan, that the sun stood directly overhead at noon on the summer solstice. No shadow in a deep well. In Alexandria that same noon, he measured a shadow angle of about 7.2 degrees. Multiply by 50, since 7.2 degrees is 1/50th the circle, and you get a full 360 degrees. Multiply the measured distance between Alexandria and Cn, and you get Earth's circumference. His result, depending on the stadium unit, lands astonishingly close to modern values. Egyptian geography and the habit of precision timekeeping gave Hellenistic science one of its biggest wins. Claudius Ptolemy compiled the Almagest in Alexandria in the 2nd century, building a geocentric model with epicycles to predict planetary motions and a star catalogue that would dominate for over a millennium. That treatise stands as Greek astronomy, but it sprouted in Egyptian soil, using an Egyptian calendar reform. The priests had resisted adding a leap day in 238 B when Ptolemy III issued the Canopus decree, proposing an extra day every 4 years to keep the civil calendar aligned with the solar year. The decree makes the logic clear, in Greek and in hieroglyphs. Add 1 day for order. Reality's good idea arrived late to general acceptance. Only under Augustus, around 25-26 Buth, did the Egyptian civil calendar get an official leap day, creating the Alexandrian calendar that later became the Coptic one. The new year in that reform settled near August 29th in the Julian calendar. Egyptian bureaucracy finally acknowledged what the astronomer priests had been juggling informally for centuries. Temple art suggests knowledge of precession's effects in a practical way, without a Greek-level theory. Decans drifted slowly, relative to the civil calendar due to the lack of leap days. Helical rising dates changed. Temples rebuilt or reoriented across dynasties hint at an awareness that things have shifted. There's no Egyptian treatise, like Hipparchus's clear statement around 150 Bars that the equinox points move relative to the fixed stars. But the sky's creeping motion forced adaptations. Karnak's festival calendar and sunrise alignments show centuries of recalibration. Observers noticed the change, even if the theory to explain it stayed unspoken. Practice outran prose. Star lore funneled into funerary texts with an agenda. The king becomes a star. The dead navigate with star names. The pyramid texts, earliest religious texts carved in stone inside burials from the late 5th and 6th dynasties, speak of the deceased ruler joining the circumpolar imperishables and the decanal stars. The coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom broaden that cosmic language to non-royals on wooden coffins, smearing star power across the middle class. Chapter spells include instructions for knowing the names of the gates in the sky and for becoming a star. The Book of the Dead refines those spells. Maat, the principle of cosmic order, literally appears as a feather weighed against the heart. The scale exists not only in moral tales, but in measurable cosmology. Straight chords, square corners, measured hours. Morality and measurement merged in their word for truth. While the Star Watchers handled metaphysics, they also supervised the daily grind. The Hour Watchers managed opening gates, lighting lamps, chanting at exact alignments. A priesthood in white linen kept the cosmic schedule. The Mercaton Bay, the plumb line and sighting rod, served as basic transit levels. 2 Merkids could be set at a known distance with a taut cord to align with any star's transit across the meridian. Shadows were tracked with pegs and L-shaped devices to determine midday and quarter divisions. The stretching of the cord cemented the geometry into the layout of sanctuaries and pylons. Those cords and pegs delivered straightness, which the language equated with properness. Cosmic order got installed with pegs, and then people walked through it. Myths about Egyptian astronomy never stay in their lane, so a polite traffic cop helps. The claim that Egyptians knew the speed of light or planned the pyramid to encode pi by design belongs to the family of ideas that fall in love with numbers and forget how messy masonry is. Ratios close to pi or the golden ratio appear in dimensions because triangles and slopes come with limited simple options that builders like. That is not a secret math cult. That is a bricklayer choosing a slope that won't collapse and looks nice. The idea that the Sphinx dates to 10,500 BC, aligned with Leo to announce processional ages, skips the geology, the archaeology, and the inscriptions. The Sphinx sits at Giza with bedrock matching Khafre's quarry, its face carved in a style consistent with the 4th dynasty, and a processional complex tied to nearby temples. It faces due east, a sensible orientation for a solar monument. The age of Leo alignment dissolves when the actual horizon, actual declination, and actual construction context get applied. Reality carries enough cosmic drama on its own. Clever details lurk where tourists don't always look. The diagonal star tables on Middle Kingdom coffins, often from the Asia region, appear for the deceased as if a portable sky clock got painted inside the box. Star names cluster with epithets, and the decans slide diagonally across months, showing their hour shifts. The old kingdoms, Seba hieroglyph. For star, a simple 5-pointed figure, appears on ceilings in dozens, like splashed paint that spells destiny. In Senemut's tomb, the southern ceiling shows decans and planets. The northern shows circumpolar constellations, rotating around a central point. The art isn't scientific illustration. It's symbolic geometry, but it captures real sky behavior. Scholars lean on Neugebauer and Parker to decode the logic, and the fit is tight enough to trust that these priests tracked actual rises and culminations rather than inventing fantasy. Then the Dendera zodiac turns up and throws in Greek glamour. On the ceiling of a small chapel attached to the rooftop of Hathor's temple, a round stone slab maps the ecliptic with Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and the rest marching around. Decans appear in little boats. Planets hover in the signs. The whole image dates to the late Ptolemaic period, around 50 BC. Its removal to Paris in 1822 via saws and manpower fits an era that treated Pantheon ceilings like posters. The zodiac's presence doesn't mean Egyptians suddenly abandoned decans. It means they curated a new cosmic language. Priests could read both dialects, Egyptian decans for temple schedules, and Greek zodiacs for new astrological services sold to cosmopolitan clients in Alexandria and beyond. Those services left a paper trail. Greek and Demotic papyri record birth, horoscopes with the sign rising, the ascendant, planetary longitudes in degrees, and predictions for life events. One papyrus might give a date like year X of the Emperor Y, month Z, hour such and such, the moon in Taurus, the sun in Libra, Saturn in Aquarius, then proceed to interpret temperament or professional fate. Egyptian astrologers adopted Greek mathematical tools and Babylonian period tables with flair. They plugged gods into the system where it helped. Isis and Serapis joined new assemblies of planetary powers. Hellenistic Egypt became the place where worldviews got blended, like a very expensive cocktail. Still, the oldest strand of Egyptian cosmic belief remained simpler. The Nile rose during the heliacal rising of Sirius, a link so tight that Egypt's language and religion fused star and flood. Sopdet the star equaled heavenly waters arriving when the world needed them. Isis, the later version of Sopdet, lamented and revived Osiris, and the river performed the same cycle across fields. Farmers could smell the silt and count on a date. Administrators could plan grain storage and temple offerings by season. The civil calendar might drift. The star and river still winked at each other each summer, even when Sothic rising dates slid across the civil months over centuries. The phenomenon persisted. A star's dawn appearance, a river rising, a country exhaling. That pairing powered big rituals in Thebes. The Opet festival saw statues of Ammon, Mut, and Khonsu sail from Karnak to Luxor by river during inundation season, renewing the king's divine authority. Sunlight and water wrote the same script. Kingship borrowed power from cosmic cycles. Cosmic cycles promised harvests and social stability. The festival's timing and the axial lines of temples created a theater where the audience was the sky. That approach explains why temple axes mattered. Light had to walk to specific places at specific moments, and priests had to be present to say the right words at the right time. The House of Life, the temple scribal school, trained people in both texts and time. That training included arithmetic, nimbleness, Egyptian numeric texts like the Rhind mathematical papyrus, c. 1550 Bas, show a refined sense of fractions and unit rates, handy for granaries, but also for calibrating clocks and apportioning offerings by hour. Egyptian mathematical scribes didn't invent trigonometry as Greek mathematicians would later formalize it, but they had geometry by rope stretches, laid out right angles, and cardinal lines. They aimed to make ground mirror heaven, and then they put a roof over it. Ancient observers didn't forget Mercury and Venus. Morning and evening star appearances of Venus gained mythic weight as manifestations of Hathor or Isis. There is no surviving Egyptian equivalent of Babylon's Venus tables, which predicted the planet's cycles with month-by-month precision. But the visual splendor of Venus flanking the sun at dawn or dusk was too bright to ignore. Mercury's skittish visibility hugged the sun even closer. He appears in lists and on astronomical ceilings, not as a system of equations. Mars glowed blood orange and was associated with Horus in some contexts and Seth in others, depending on whether it behaved in a friendly way or barged in like a brawler. Jupiter and Saturn wandered slowly, the elder gods strolling the promenades. These character assignments speak to what mattered: visible behavior and ritual association. The priests needed to know when a planet would be in a certain part of the sky for a festival, not draw an ellipse. Meteor showers and comets show up less clearly. Egypt did not leave behind star catalogues, noting great hair star year after year. This absence suggests priorities rather than ignorance. Babylonian omen texts cared about these things as portents for kings. Egyptian texts paid more attention to repeating cycles that kept temples on schedule and fields irrigated. When the cosmos misbehaved, an eclipse, a strange light, priests had liturgies ready to defend the sun. The daily solar rebirth ritual mattered more than tallying occasional anomalies. A world that values order cultivates amnesia toward disruptions. Looking back across 3,000 years, the continuity still stuns. Decans on 12th dynasty coffins in Middle Egypt, a water clock inscribed under Amenhotep III, sunrise pouring down Karnak's axis, starboats on royal tomb ceilings, a stone zodiac under the Ptolemies, paper horoscopes under Roman emperors, all parts of the same conversation. Cosmology never sat in a corner. It ran festivals, told time, arranged stones, set taxes, and soothed anxiety. The same priests who watched Sopdet at dawn oversaw the weighing of hearts and the distribution of bread. The sky was not a hobby. It was infrastructure. The infrastructure got granular. The decanal system had internal mechanics. Each decan, one of 36, spanned 10 degrees along the ecliptic. In a single night, the heliacal decan rose first, followed by 2 more at roughly 40-minute intervals, marking the first 3 night hours. As the year progressed, decans shifted by about 10 days, advancing their nightly schedule to keep time across seasons. Star tables included substitutions when the usual decan dipped below the horizon or was too close to the sun. Priests carried an index in their heads and on the walls. Neugebauer and Parker mapped those transitions and demonstrated that Egyptian star clocks were dynamic, not naive. The nightly schedule was a living tool, updated by observation. The language captured this intimacy. The hieroglyph for hour, non-dot ties to watchers. Time and watchers were one. The hour watchers had titles. The chief of observers kept the discipline. They didn't stand alone. Priests worked in teams across the big temples, with someone on shadow duty by day and someone by water clock at night, because the gods didn't accept tardiness. The daily cult of Ammon in Thebes demanded pre-dawn preparation. Morning anointing, midday offerings, evening hymns. Astronomy's job was to get the keys turned and the doors opened on schedule. The living god masks had to meet the sun. Architecture can still speak for that schedule. Walk the axis of Luxor Temple at sunset. The colonnades frame a slice of sky. At certain times of year, the sun aligns perfectly, turning the avenue into a golden river. Belmonte and Schultaut's data show other temples, pointed towards sunrise at the start of the Egyptian colloquial year in some regions. Others match the harvest sun or a particular festival. The statistical clustering of orientations around solstitial and equinoctial azimuth isn't random. Builders oriented their sanctuaries to cosmic moments, not to cardinal points out of habit. This also explains why some axes are wrong by modern expectations. They weren't shooting for due east. They were aiming for dawn on the first day of a festival in perpetuity. If the horizon included a hill, the construction adapted to hit the light at the right time. The sky is not uniform across latitudes or terrains. Egyptians knew that. The temple steps did too. Alignment didn't stop at sunrise. The northern doors of the sky mattered for the king's afterlife. Circumpolar stars never set. Their immortality mapped onto the idea that the king was an imperishable star. Pyramid shafts pointed toward that region. Texts claimed that destination. Tomb ceilings turned rotation into visual loops. There's poetry in the physics. Those stars circle the pole forever. No death for the ones that never sink. Political theology wrote itself at the zenith. A different part of the sky delivered public service announcements. The new crescent moon thinned and fattened each month, visible above the western horizon at dusk, rising after the sun, then switching sides near new moon and appearing at dawn. Lunar festivals dotted calendars. The Egyptians counted lunar months for ritual calendars, parallel to the civil one, reconciling by intercalations now and then with pragmatic tolerance. A lunar day one, headstand to you, literally shining ones. The day of the first sighting, anchored schedules in a way that fit actual sky conditions, not just the paperwork-friendly civil date. The interplay of lunar and civil time was a lived reality for centuries. Even after the Alexandrian reform added a leap day, the question, what does the sky say, kept a place beside, what does the register say? In the late period, Priests crafted decanal amulets and astrological talismans, linking specific star groups to protective powers. Decans acquired deities and symbols. Medical papyri advised on treatments tied to stars and days. Papyrus Ebers, compiled around 1550 BUS, includes a note on the heliacal rising of Sophis within a medical context. Physiology and cosmology shared the same papyrus, because the rhythm of the heavens was health or harm on earth. On a bad day in the Cairo calendar, staying home and skipping important tasks counted as responsible behavior. Cosmic risk management existed, and it came in daily formats. Confronted with this giant view, modern brains tend to search for a single genius figure or one master idea. Ancient Egypt answers with distributed competence. Through 3 millennia, specialists observed, scribes recopied, builders aligned, and priests timed. The real star is the system. That system absorbed and adapted. When the Greeks brought zodiac math, Egypt said yes and no with equal ease. Yes to zodiac signs carved on ceilings and horoscopes in Greek on papyrus. No to abandoning decans, hemerologies, and sunrise axes in temples. The calculus of continuity beat the calculus of replacement. Sirius stayed the story's recurring character. Around 3000 B at Memphis's latitude, about 29.9 degrees N, the heliacal rising of Sirius occurred around mid-July in the Julian projection. By Roman times, because of precession and the switch to the Julian-based Alexandrian calendar, the date pinned near the 19th of July in Roman reckoning. Though this figure always needs context. Latitude shifts the visibility by days. Atmospheric conditions smear the moment by a few more. Still, that July window dominates the history. Farmers didn't need ephemerides. They watched dawn. Once the star rose, the inundation arrived weeks later, as the river's long spine carried water from Ethiopian rains north through Nubia into Egypt. The star announcement predated the flood by a practical planning interval. A stellar early warning system in the Bronze Age beats a smartphone notification at any museum of better ideas. The Nile's predictability with cosmic cues cemented Egypt's sense that the world could be aligned. It isn't that they were naive about disaster. Years of low floods caused famine and revolt. The admonitions of Ipuwer, a Middle Kingdom text, with earlier echoes, laments a world turned upside down when Ma'at, order, fails. Yet prediction fostered resilience. Priests tracked extremes and normal ranges with nilometers, stone staircases etched with height marks along the river. The best-known nilometer at Elephantine, and later ones at Rhoda near Cairo, recorded water levels that determined tax rates. A pleasing blend of hydrology and bureaucratic motivation. Here, too, the cosmos and cash met on a staircase. Egypt's astronomy never isolated itself on mountaintops. It lived on banks and roofs and within sanctuaries where the sun's light had a timed appointment with the god's face. In an age before watches, it delivered punctuality. In a culture obsessed with the afterlife, it provided a map. The soul needed star routes. The state needed sunrise schedules. Both got what they wanted by looking up with discipline. Ancient observers recorded the night with a kind of fearless literalness. Stars were not metaphors. They were addresses. Sa was Orion, and Orion was Osiris, and Osiris controlled cycles of death and rebirth that found analogues in crops and kings. Sopet was a goddess, and also a star whose dawn light meant river water and taxes. The foreleg of a bull was a constellation pivot, and also a mythic object of power. Layering was the point. The sky wore religion the way a temple wore paint. No one in that world would have asked for a clean separation of astronomy from theology. The separation belongs to modern minds who prefer categories. In Egypt, categories overlapped and nodded politely to one another as they crossed thresholds. The evidence base for all this looks like a patchwork stitched over centuries, which is exactly what it is. Neugebauer and Parker's mid-20th century compilation, Egyptian astronomical texts, remains the reference shelf for decans and star clocks. Belmonte and Chaltaut's On the Orientation of Ancient Egyptian Temples gives the statistics that rule out random orientations. The tomb ceilings of Senenmut, Driti 53, Seti Verse, KP 17, and Ramesses Vi, KP 9, hold the visual encyclopedia. The Dendera round zodiac, carved around 50 bas and hauled to the Louvre in 1822, acts as the flag for Hellenistic uptake. Papyrus Ebers and the Cairo calendar preserve the early merge of daily life with cosmic time. The Canopus Decree, 238 BC, and Augustus's later calendar reform anchor the leap day debate. Kate Spence's Nature paper sketches the circumpolar star method for finding north. Rudolf Gantenbrink's Upuo robot made a splash with the pyramid shaft doors. Each piece sits on a timescale. Together, they form a civilization watching itself by starlight. In the end, the wry part of this story is that the supposed mysteries look less like secret codes and more like workplace best practices. A temple needed time. Solution: decans and water clocks. A festival needed sunrise on the sanctum's face. Solution: axis alignment determined by chords under the stars. A king needed eternal life. Solution: shafts aiming toward the undying northern stars and texts promising admission to the cosmic club. A year needed a start. Solution: watch Sirius at dawn and nudge the ledger. Even the adoption of Greek-style astrology under the Ptolemies reads as a business move. The clientele in Alexandria wanted horoscopes. The priesthood already knew decans, planets, and lunar cycles. They wrapped the Greek math in Egyptian ritual and sold answers. That is not cynicism. That is cultural agility. As a last elegant detail that keeps Egypt's skywork lodged in memory, the word mad means truth, order, balance. It is often pictured as a feather. On Judgment Day, a heart gets weighed against that feather. If lighter, the deceased passes. If heavier, chaos wins. The astronomical counterpart to that scale sits on temple axes and on the rope of the rope stretchers. Straightness equals justice. A plumb line holds as seriously as a priest holds a hymn. The cosmos that the Egyptians served with star clocks and solstitial light shows was not an abstraction. It was a thing one could build to, walk into, and keep on schedule. So the story ends where it began. On that rooftop, with the dawn barely smudging the east, the priest with the merket waits. A fleck of light burns through the blue. Sopdet returns. The year turns on a pin of starlight. The Nile, miles away and days behind, will answer on cue, and the architectural skeleton of Egypt, from pyramid shafts to temple corridors, stands ready to catch light and give it somewhere important to go. The system hums without fuss. In a world stacked with myths and miracles, the biggest magic act remains the simplest. A civilization looked up, wrote its calendar in the stars, and kept it running for 3,000 years.